Hola, muy buenas tardes y buenos días, según desde donde nos estén escuchando. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Estamos recién conectándonos, así que vamos a esperar unos minutos para que todo el público inscrito pueda unirse. Vamos a esperar algunos minutos más antes de comenzar, mientras se une la audiencia. Hola, buenas tardes a todos aquellos que se están sumando recién. Estamos dando algunos minutos mientras el público termina de unirse a la conexión. For English speakers, we will give the instructions in a few minutes so you can hear us in English, okay? Muy bienvenidos. Vemos algunas personas de la UDD conectados, por ejemplo Guido Larsson, que es el director del Instituto de Humanidades. También está María Cristina Silva, quien es académica de la Facultad de Comunicaciones. Y también veo acá a personas que han estado participando durante la semana, por ejemplo Sebastián Briones, Jan Sang, espero que se pronuncie así. Estamos esperando algunos minutos y ya vamos a comenzar. Bueno, vamos a comenzar. Muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas las asistentes. Mi nombre es Daniela Bruna, directora de la carrera de Psicología en la Facultad de Psicología de la sede de Concepción, de la Universidad del Desarrollo, y también soy investigadora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación, CIME. Quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida al segundo encuentro internacional virtual en enseñanza, aprendizaje y evaluación en educación superior. Hoy es el quinto día de transmisión de esta actividad que realizaremos durante toda esta semana y la siguiente. Antes de comenzar, quisiera darles algunas indicaciones respecto a la traducción simultánea de este evento. Esto que les contaré también va a estar escrito en el chat. Para seleccionar la interpretación simultánea, debe seleccionar el icono del globo terráqueo que encontrarán en la barra inferior de su panel de Zoom. Al pinchar, selecciona el idioma en el que quieres escuchar toda la actividad, sin importar en qué idioma hable el expositor. Estaremos pendientes al chat por cualquier problema o ayuda que necesite. To select simultaneous interpretation, you must select the globe icon that you will find in the bottom bar of your Zoom panel. You must select the language in which you want to hear the entire activity, regardless of which language the exhibitor speaks. We will be waiting to chat for any problem or help you need. Los invitamos además a participar de esta actividad realizando sus preguntas a lo largo de ella en la sección preguntas y respuestas que está en la barra inferior de Zoom. Les pedimos que el chat lo usen solo en caso de problemas técnicos, ¿ya? Les comento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de la universidad, uddtv.udd.cl, y que durante los próximos días enviaremos el video y el PowerPoint a todos los participantes que se han inscrito. Esperamos que hoy la tecnología y las conexiones nos acompañen, pero les pedimos consideración si es que tuviésemos algún problema técnico durante la transmisión. Comentarles también que tras esta presentación dejaremos el video disponible en nuestro sitio web. Agradecemos a los inscritos interesados en participar y los invitamos a informarse siempre de nuestras actividades en la web psicología.udd.cl y en nuestras redes sociales @psicologiaudd. Para comenzar, inicia con la ponencia las investigadoras doctora Sally Brown y la doctora Kay Samble con su presentación titulada Hacia la evaluación auténtica, fomentando el aprendizaje y participación de los estudiantes. La doctora Sally Brown ha sido galardonada con doctorados honorarios en la Universidad de Plymouth, la Universidad de Kingston, la Universidad Napier de Edimburgo, la Universidad Bournemouth y la Universidad de Lincoln. Es profesora emérita de diversidad en enseñanza y aprendizaje en educación superior en la Universidad de Leeds Beckett y estuvo allí hasta julio del 2010 como académica. También es profesora visitante en la Universidad de Edge Hill. Anteriormente ocupó cátedras visitantes en la Universidad de Robert Gordon, la Universidad de Plymouth, la Universidad John Moores de Liverpool y la Universidad de South Wales. También fue profesora adjunta a la Universidad de Sunshine Coast y la Universidad James Cook, ambas de Queensland, Australia. La doctora Kay Sample, por su parte, es conocida a nivel nacional e internacional por sus contribuciones al movimiento de evaluación para el aprendizaje, AFL, en la educación superior. Ha encabezado una serie de innovaciones pragmáticas, proyectos de investigación, publicaciones e iniciativas centradas en mejorar el aprendizaje de los estudiantes universitarios a través de su participación activa en los procesos de evaluación y retroalimentación educativa. Kay, ganadora del premio National Teaching Fellow del Reino Unido el 2002 y Principal Fellow, es oradora principal habitual y líder de talleres sobre cuestiones de aprendizaje, enseñanza y evaluación. Como profesora en la Universidad de Cambridge, ayudó a establecer y apoyar la serie de conferencias internacionales de evaluación de educación superior. Sally y Kay, muchas gracias. Pueden comenzar.
Muchas gracias. Soy Sally Brown y mi colega Kay Sample, todos los dos en el nordeste de Inglaterra. I am going to speak to you from now on in English because my Spanish is not terribly strong, but I'm very fond of the Spanish language, the Spanish people, and also have visited Chile in the past. My colleague and friend, Kay Sample, and I have worked together on assessment for learning for more than 3 decades, together and separately. And one of the real joys of our time now is we're both relatively retired, but we both do a lot of work together in putting forward the principles that we worked on when we worked together at the University of Northumbria. We are delighted to share with you our work. We're delighted to enable you to look at and explore our ideas on authentic assessment, which we have put together particularly during the pandemic times. Right at the beginning, in March 2020, Kay and I found, like every university in Britain and all over the world, we were trying to deal with our colleagues how to assess students when it wasn't possible to work on site. So what we did is we started putting out materials on our website, my website and Kay's, and sharing those with the wider community. And we've been very gratified that those materials have gone worldwide, used in 4 continents at least, and that's been very gratifying. We've built them up, and every month or so we add more materials, and we'll be pointing to those a little later on. In our session, what we're planning on doing is sharing with you our broad views on what authentic assessment can be and can look like, but more particularly how that can be translated into very, very pragmatic examples in order to make this workable for staff and for students. And before I ask Kay to move on to the next slide, I just want to thank very much the simultaneous translators, who I know are working incredibly hard to keep us all able to follow this conference, whatever language we're working in. I also want to thank Veronica Villarroel and Daniel Brunner for making us so welcome at this conference. So, in the spring of 2020, the world did change, not just in the UK, but everywhere. People were finding that in the past, where they'd used a great deal of time-constrained, unseen, invigilated exams, this just wasn't possible for people when they couldn't go on campus. And what that's done, I think, is put a lever into practice, the kind of practice that Kay and I have been proposing, as I say, for 3 decades. so that institutional leaders, vice chancellors, principals, presidents began to realize that actually the changes we had to make during the emergency can actually transform learning for students because they have real benefits. Our aim was to support the appetite for this by trying to make sure that assessment in the future was fit for purpose. But we're always remembering that we need to consider how this can be made manageable and compassionate for both staff and students. The students must be able to achieve this. The staff must be able to find the workload manageable. And now I'm going to hand over to Kay.
Thanks, Sally. So, sorry, I'm trying to multitask. There we go. Yeah, so I think it's really important to stress that our views and the things that we generated in our COVID collection are very much rooted in our involvement over a lot of years in assessment for learning. And assessment for learning, in summary, is all about trying to ensure that assessment stimulates and supports productive learning as well as measuring it. So we're trying to strike a better balance. That's the sort of philosophy. And I guess this means building productively on the substantial evidence base from what's become known as the assessment for learning movement in higher education. And if you boil that down in a nutshell, it exhorts us to re-engineer and redesign our assessment and feedback practices so that they stimulate two things, so that they stimulate student engagement in productive high order learning for the longer term. So that's involving them very actively in tasks and activities which will help them learn to develop the ways of thinking of practicing of their subject areas and develop the skills and competencies that they'll need beyond graduation. And it also means empowering and supporting them while they're on our programmes to exercise increasing levels of control for their own learning, rather than simply being recipients of other people's judgments. So they're developing the skills of self-regulation and all the kinds of skills and qualities they'll need after they've graduated. So this really means paying heed to the three interrelated areas of assessment for learning that I've depicted on this diagram here. There's lots of work on all of these things, but here we're just going to try and focus mainly today on the top one, which is about helping learners become energized and engaged by designing more authentic learning-oriented assessment tasks. Now, Sally and I want to argue that in all cases, it's really important whether students believe that the assessment tasks that are being set on their university courses feel somehow realistic and authentic, because it's damaging in a whole host of ways if students view them as inauthentic or artificial or contrived or relatively meaningless beyond the immediate context of being tested and getting marks. So the literature on authentic assessment is really helpful because it encourages us to ask ourselves, are we helping students to perceive the connections between what they're doing in their university assessment and the worlds that exist outside the classroom? So we're asking them to use and apply the skills and curriculum knowledge in an integrated manner when they're tackling our assignments, so they can apply what they've learned in plausible situations or in conditions that are going to crop up again for them in future, or doing tasks which they see as meaningful and relevant to their personal interests, or which have a bearing on the world their discipline is supposed to explain. Or they're immersed in really getting to grips with the subject and feeling like they're doing the subject and justifying any solutions they come up with, rather than simply responding to the trigger of a question or going through the motions, what Ramsden used to call doing imitation subjects rather than real ones. And if you take that into account, of those engaging in tasks which encourage students to spend that kind of time on task in the run-up to those tasks, then opens the door for much more active involvement at the bottom of my diagram in feedback processes and self-evaluation processes. So I'll hand back over to Sally to take us through the timeline of our work.
Let me emphasize that what Kay and I started doing in spring 2020 was built on a considerable body of research that we'd both done together and separately over the years, some of which Kay's alluded to there, and the other people have done. Because what we've been saying for a long, long time is there are better ways of assessing than the ways that are used globally for the most part in higher education, which very often rely on unseen time-constrained exams. So the very first one was saying, here we are in this situation, what on earth are we going to do about it? And the next one that followed was when people were saying, well, if you can't do time-constrained exams, what can you do? And then the next one that followed that was thinking about different kinds of replacement. Then we came to a crucial paper of ours, which is called Writing Better Assignments. It's highlighted here, in the post-COVID era. And what we did there was we created a tool which enables colleagues across the globe to create better ways of assessing, which embody the more authentic principles that we've been arguing for over the years. And I'll be taking you through what we call the task generator a little later on. Then we went on to talk about how this period had made it possible for people like us, staff developers, educational developers, faculty developers, learning developers, to actually say, now is our chance to change assessment for good. Then we started collecting wonderful examples from all over the place of really good authentic assessment examples that made use of the kinds of principles we were putting forward. And those came out on the 19th of May and March and the 3rd of May. People said to us, but you can't do authentic assessment in mathematics. But we came across the amazing Professor Giuseppe Zorlo in Galway University in Ireland, whose talks about motivating mathematics through assessment through his Mechanics Tales was terribly inspiring and caused him to win the President's Award for Outstanding Teaching at NUI Galway. We've then picked up created another compendium in August, and then we went on to produce in November authentic creative assessment, an active essay writing project, and then we're very proud to say our first internationally sourced collection. We've had Irish and British ones so far, for the most part, 1 or 2 Australians, but we had a whole collection which we just published on the 17th of November, all coming from Hong Kong. And we'd be delighted to see more examples from other colleagues in Chile. We'd love some good examples, but also from the other colleagues who are represented in the audience of this conference. So now we move on to the next slide. And in that slide, I'm going to talk about how over this period we were changing. And our argument is we must never go back. We mustn't go back to relying on the kind of assignment you see represented in the bare desk there, sets of students sitting in rows, because we argue that the time and the place and duration constraints have really high risks, not just during COVID, but for example, when other crises hit universities, which do worldwide, where there are continuity interruptions, and we don't want to just be thrown together on the hoof mitigations. The other thing that we are constantly seeing from the colleagues who work with us is students do better if they can see the relevance of what they're doing in their assessed tasks. They become more engaged and put more into it, because then they will be better prepared for employment, yes, entrepreneurship, civil society, good citizenship. And that's what life really requires of them. And the range of activities that are thereby created in a written exam can be very limited, because writing with a pen without access to resources is not normally what most people do in the world of work nowadays. So in employment and wider context, most people will have access to resources and a keyboard and team members, and those are the kinds of things that we are thinking that students should be able to do. And although we keep talking about employment, this isn't just about employability. Authentic assessment goes much wider than this. So, okay, now we go on to talk about more diverse exam formats. This is your first stage, entry stage. If you've got to have exams, do they have to rely on memory? Can't they use open book exams where they're able to take reference sources in, or use laptops where certain things are allowed, whitelisted onto the laptop, and they can use those? Can they use, for example, take-home exams? That is off-site exams. What kinds of different formats can they use? And there we give you some references to things that might be useful if that's an area you're considering. But let's go next, Kay. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, so, thanks, Sally. So I think these were the sorts of things that were coming out and were very useful to people in the very early days on the timeline that Sally was talking about just there. And we saw these kinds of papers coming out, or people citing these papers to get to change their exams. And I guess in those early days, I mean, we were only talking sort of March 2020 and the early COVID days, where exam halls had closed. We got a lot of people, certainly in the UK, looking to build on what they were calling open book exams. So they were having students sitting exams remotely, and once they weren't actually sitting in exam halls, we did start to see quite a lot of people at scale really thinking about the innovative alternatives that they could come up with, but actually they take quite a bit of time to prepare. And we started seeing people asking more questions about when they get back to something that's a bit more normal, can we think of better innovative alternative exams, things like in-tray exercises, where students are working live on changing priorities as a live exam unfolds in a way which would sort of simulate professional activity of an accountant, say. They've been going on for quite some time, or things like two-stage exams, where students could talk to peers or to improve their initial exam answers. So there's lots of things to do to improve the authenticity of exams. But Sally and I are arguing that rather than spending all our time on redesigning exam formats, which is what we saw a lot of people worrying about, it could be much more productive to consider the host of alternative formats that are available. And again, we set these out in that Changing Landscape paper, which is in the middle of the timeline, because after all, higher education has got a long tradition of much more authentic, interesting and learning-oriented formats, things like blogs, things like video recordings and audio recordings, or getting students to create leaflets or websites which are aimed at a specific audience. And we were advocating these in the Changing Landscapes paper, because asking students to produce what they often see as a more meaningful assessment output with what they might see as a real audience helps them to see this sort of sense of worth of their learning for the longer term. And if they're directing things at what they see as an actual audience, at the public or at a client, or writing something for a less experienced students, that can help boost their sense of developing professionalism, or helping them feel like they're communicating their learning to an authentic audience. As well as getting them to engage in kind of realistic, social or reflective writing practices. So all those kinds of things might be more amenable to the kinds of things that authenticity is actually all about. And some of those formats, you know, get students to work on subtasks over time, and they can explicitly help them to get involved in decision making and choice making. So they're following their personal interests or linking their academic work to their own lives where it's appropriate. And those sorts of things we know from our own prior research can be really motivating and enjoyable for students. So they become really personal projects. And we often hear students talking to us about, you know, having a sense that it's not just about the marks, but when we're producing something that might actually help other people, it's actually going to get used. That's really powerful. So we outline all of those in our COVID collection in the Changing Landscapes paper. But the key question for us moving forward from that was, once people were getting back a bit more onto campus, how could we re-energize assessment to boost authenticity and thereby boost student engagement? And so for us, the literature on authentic assessment really helped us to generate the task generator that Sally will talk to you about in a moment. Because it helps us to think about designing tasks that are designed to have value and meaning to students beyond merely the mark or score that they achieve. But we often found in our workshops that quite often the allusion in the literature to realism often gets associated in people's minds only with work-related or professionally oriented practices, where it's useful, we thought it was useful to broaden out much more widely, as in the maths example that Sally just went through. So Sally and I found Lydia Arnold's thinking recently really useful when developing the task generator, and she builds, of course, on Veronica and her colleagues' work. She highlights the importance of realism, cognitive challenge, and evaluative judgment. So are students getting a sense of a plausible context in which to work? Are they developing high order capabilities such as problem solving, critical thinking and that kind of thing? And are they really feeling like they're immersed in a project where they're involved in reflection and review activities and the development of evaluative judgment? But Lydia also usefully highlights the importance of leveraging a student's sense of assessment's relevance, whether that's to the professional community, to the discipline community, or to the self. And I think that's there's lots of benefits from broadening out and thinking about these things for all disciplines, because Lydia helps us think about all these kind of motivating factors which help inclusivity and all those kinds of things. But also there's a recent systematic review which really found that authentic assessment benefits include students' enhanced engagement, improved satisfaction, and contributed very much to boosting students' effort to reach those high order educational goals and enhanced employability skills. But as Sally said, drawing on all of this and all the work that we'd done previously, we set out to come up with this pragmatic, manageable process, which was really going to help hard-pressed academics who are working under awful circumstances, having to rapidly design better assessments, to design more authentic tasks when time and resources were really of the essence during the pandemic and campus closures. So the task generator is all about that. And they didn't have time to develop authentic assessment in its purest form. And so whilst it's all about having an impact on deep approaches to learning and employability, we also wanted to focus really emphatically on the ways in which assessment might become relevant and worthwhile and offer some level of control in much broader ways too. So recognizing, as Muller says, there are degrees of authenticity and that some disciplines may demand a greater degree than others, we were really keen to make something available so that students in all disciplines should benefit from a broadening of assessment tasks. So we were keen not to just simply conflate authentic tasks only with the world of work, but to encourage staff who are coming for help to us to think of it much more broadly in terms of fostering students' personal growth, personal development, and designing assessments to help students see themselves as someone who can apply their subject knowledge to make a difference in local, civic or social communities, or to develop a keener sense of belonging in a disciplinary community, or developing a sense of agency or personal fulfillment, or feeling that they were part of their university's mosaic of talent in knowledge exchange exercises. Because as Jan MacArthur powerfully points out, if you've read her work, in her case, she's coming from a social justice perspective, Authentic assessment can be a really powerful force in shaping students' identity and self-worth. So we've just tried to capture our whole person approach in this Venn diagram, just to illustrate how we think that self-realization and personal fulfillment can be sparked by authentic assessment, as well as its much more traditional associations in people's minds with longer-term deep learning and its links to professional practice and the world of work. So now I'll hand over to Sally, who will take us through the practicalities of the task generator and give you some illustrative examples of what from the compendia that we've curated subsequently. So over to you, Sally.
Thank you. And what we're trying to say is that what started from a position where we were trying to think about how we can make this possible for people to write authentic assignments without it being a massive job of work every time. So we thought it had to be systematized. So you can see here in the diagram on the right, our approach has been summarized by our friend and colleague Katrina Swanton Sketches. And if we just go along the bottom of that picture, you'll see that the point at which we suggest people start, it was the learning outcomes, the things that we say in our curriculum design that students will be able to know, do, or be by the end of the program. Now, in all of those learning outcomes, there are verbs, the doing words. And what we want to see is how that translates into the activity, the task. And if there is a verb, what is the object of that verb? What are they actually going to do? And then moving from the object, we then go to the outcome, the evidence of achievement. Wrap that round with context and you get our task generator. So in our next slide, I'll take you through some examples of how that works in practice. So let's start off with some nice buzzy verbs. You'll often find in the learning outcomes a word like interpret or review or set up or evaluate or compile. Let's see, what are they going to interpret or evaluate? Well, you might ask them to interpret sometimes complex and incomplete or conflicting data. What do they have to do? How will we know if they've done it or not? Then they need to compile a summary that's meaningful for experts and laypersons. And a bit more information about that, what we're calling modifiers, developments, range statements, it leads to a viable action plan. Now, there's one thing missing from these things, and that is the context in which they're working. So we need to wrap it around with a context. Let's have a look at another example. Students are going to be asked to review data from a variety of sources to produce an executive summary for a specific audience. They're going to be asked to set up specialized equipment appropriately so they can draw up a quick guide for peers so that their colleagues can do whatever they've just been doing that will enable them to use it safely and appropriately. They're going to be asked to evaluate 3 proposed solutions to a problem and think of 2 more of their own with suggestions about what might work best. Or they might be asked to compile contingency plans for a professional environment to produce a disaster recovery plan in the case of a serious emergency, leading to mitigations. Now, in a minute, we're going to show you some examples of this. But before we do that, what I want to say is where you've devised a context, you might next year keep the context and change the activity you ask them to do, or where you keep the activities, you might want to change the context or plausible scenario. This way, it becomes quite economical, and everybody likes to tell stories. Everybody likes to be able to see how this works in action. And by putting these practical activities into a context, students can see what's required of them. They're not messing around inside a black box. They can see what they're supposed to do. So in the next slide, we are going to thank Thomas Broderick of the Munster Technological University in Ireland for his example. So he decided he was going to move away from a traditional format exams in designing a range of supports at your residential home for persons with a disability what health initiatives would you propose for service users in the following areas? Physical wellness, social wellness, or occupational vocational wellness? Instead, he said, here's a nice scenario. Envisage that you're working on placement in a local residential home with persons with disability, and considering the impacts of COVID, you've been asked to introduce some new health initiatives to support residents in their overall wellness. Right, so there's the context, the plausible scenario. Now, let's have a look at the tasks that Thomas Broderick came up to go with that. And you'll see that in each case, at the beginning of these, in bold, is the verb. And then it goes through that schema that we had. So what you're going to research? You're going to research what the wellness needs of service users are and what kinds of health initiatives are most appropriate. And what you have to do is present this in a set of up to 10 bullet points with a list on one side of your A4 of your references. Here you can see we're getting them to put into practice their learning. We're asking them to keep it relatively limited. The idea is lots of time on task for the student, not lots of marking for us. The next bit, prepare a plan to implement 3 health initiatives, one each for physical, social, occupational, vocational needs, one side of A4 for each. Present in the form of a table what you think are the principal benefits of the initiatives you're proposing and any problems or pitfalls you could imagine. And you can imagine you could do these tasks over a period of time. You could either do it in a solid block or you could do it over a few weeks. But as the work is being done, some of it is going to be handed in, some of it will be shared in class with peers and colleagues, some of it will be simply a basis for what goes next. Next one, provide a rationale for the recommendation. Sorry, Kay, not the next slide. The next one is to provide a rationale for the recommendations you're making in the form of an email for your busy line manager. Kay mentioned audience before, and here we're thinking of the different audiences that they might be asked to write for. And then finally, this bit is really important to us, a reflective diary comment about what they've learned from the assignment and what insights that are going to help them go forward, because we're always keen that every activity is inclusive of reflection. Now I'd like the next slide, please. And in the next slide, I'm again tremendously grateful to Dr. Amreen Bashir of the School of Bioscience at the University of Aston in Birmingham. And what she has asked us to think about is a traditional essay assignment. She's an expert in contamination. And all I'll say to you is if you read her work, which I recommend you do, your own domestic practices might change forever. So what are the key factors caused by poor consumer behaviour in domestic bathrooms? What activities can be taken to improve health through better hygiene practices? And on to the next one. So that's a traditional one. Here's a much, much better one. The much better one, lovely context. This is very helpful for students, quite a lot of whom live in student houses. Imagine you live with a bunch of other students. One downstairs toilet, one main bathroom that everybody shares. You're the only microbiologist and you've got a bit concerned. So what we're going to ask you to do is read the 2 sets of articles. These are the ones that Amreen herself has written, and highlight or annotate a hard copy or on screen, and then take a photo and upload it. Does it have to be marked? Not necessarily. Could be the basis for classroom discussion. Next one, prepare a poster as a PowerPoint slide. And in your poster, talk about the contamination risks to your flatmates in language that's convincing rather than preachy. Can include images and information from the articles, those kinds of things. And then present your poster. And again, we're thinking of different occasions it might, either live or recorded, where you're taking us through it. And then again, a different audience, write an article of about 700 words for the student newspaper, indicating the precautions that might be taken. And then finally, as before, a reflection. I can guarantee that rather than the boring essay on contamination, students will love doing this, and it actually might influence their own lives. The third one, Okay, here's another one that's very useful. This is from Gemma Bazant of Aberystwyth in Wales. And background is buildings are some of the most important visual reminders of our past heritage and reflect our social, political and cultural histories. All of these reflect on people that designed, built and used these structures. The lifelong learning course enables participants to explore the origins of sample buildings, the people and events that shaped its history and practice, and how to record and present those data. So that's what Gemma has been asking students to do traditionally. And here's the more authentic example. She gives them a context, a plausible scenario. A historic vicarage in a remote Welsh village. If you're not from the UK, lots of buildings built in the 19th century, and lots of them now are being preserved because they're so beautiful. It's not listed, but it's lots of original features, such as sash windows and cast iron fittings. And inside the property, it sits inside lovely gardens, and the new owners want to convert it into a bed and breakfast accommodation and have asked you to provide the building its setting with options for extension and development of the business. So here are the tasks she's asking them to do instead. Based on the provided recent sales information for the property, produce a site plan for the property and the gardens that surround it, using physical and data sources, which they can get off the internet. This is like real life, isn't it? Local records about the house and its environment, just an A4 sheet of bullet points, relevant background information for the property. For example, in Britain, quite often our trees are protected and you're not allowed to cut them down. That's true of the trees in my garden. And then a different kind of task, produce a non-expert and illustrated client brief, including plans and proposals, indicating any key limitations of what can and cannot be done, because planning law is very different in the different parts of the UK as in different parts of the world. And so they need to have reference to that. They have to make sure they're working within the law. These aren't experts though, so they're not expected to give a full legal answer. And then a covering email to the clients, providing the summary advice. None of these tasks is massive. All of them relate to what these students are likely to do in real life. All of them are likely to find this not just interesting, but actively causing them to learn through doing. Okay, the next one is by an eminent Professor Samble, but it isn't you, is it?
It isn't me, and I was going to suggest we skip it, not because of the eminence, but because I'm a bit conscious of the time, Sally. So shall I skip for you?
No, don't skip it, go for it.
Oh, okay, very quickly then. So this was one taken from electronic engineering, and this was about replacing a time-constrained unseen exam. This was on a second year module on communication systems, and trying to get the students to think much more like an engineer and feel that they were belonging in the engineering community and becoming an engineer. The more authentic example was to set them, encourage the students to imagine themselves in role. So they were imagining they were a qualified engineer and they were asked to produce a feasibility study for a simulated company who wanted to install a data link. So what the lecturer asked them to do was midpoint, so here are the tasks, midpoint through the term, identify the pros and cons of 3 quite different approaches to doing this link that you could come up with. And he asked them to summarize those in a short presentation, which they delivered to the class and got in the moment tutor and peer feedback. And then in the light of that feedback process, they then selected one of the chosen approaches and used it to design the system for the simulated client. And so they were asked to submit a short proposal, which was suitable for the company board, and that would include a table which would summarize the spec and detail all their MATLAB modeling about how it was going to work, about how fast the data link would be, how much bandwidth it would need, security issues, could it be hacked, that kind of thing, how it was going to be backed up in case there was a fault, all the legal implications, were they going to need a transmitter license and all that sort of thing. And then a bullet point guide to the practical implications of introducing the system, including all the costs and the environmental factors and future-proofing it. And this is the bit I quite like. He also asked students to explain how they had responded to feedback on their formative presentation. So he was explicitly engaging them proactively with the feedback and self-evaluation process in the task itself. Over to you, Sally, for the final slide.
The 3-minute summary, and in the 3-minute summary, again, it's another Swanton Sketches wonderful version of our work. We say that through using this kind of approach, assessment can promote, support, and extend future learning, moving students from the darkness of the bottom part of this image, from before when it was all based on recall and regurgitation, over-reliance on timed and unseen exams, the anxiety-inducing, with a far too heavy base on bias towards summative rather than formative assessment. And what we're saying instead, that assessment can thereby be enabling and inclusive, get students involved in active learning, undertaking tasks they actually care about, and engaging in feedback processes, all of which can build towards self-efficacy. We say this approach of assessment can be transformational and moving students towards being inspired and engaged. We hope you find that convincing, and we look forward to your questions and comments in the panel later on. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sally y Kay. La verdad es que nos quedamos con muchos desafíos acerca de cómo implementar la evaluación auténtica, pero también con directrices claras acerca de cómo hacerlo. Y continuando con nuestro seminario, presentamos la ponencia de la doctora Verónica Villarroel, titulada Un giro en las tareas basadas en desempeño, aplicando la evaluación auténtica. La doctora Verónica Villarroel es doctora en Psicología y máster en Psicología Educacional de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Actualmente es la directora del Centro de Investigación y Mejoramiento de la Educación CIME de la Universidad del Desarrollo y docente tanto de pregrado como posgrado de esta misma institución. Se vincula a las líneas de investigación de psicología educacional, como evaluación auténtica y dialogicidad del discurso instruccional docente. Bienvenida, Verónica, puedes comenzar.
Muchas gracias, Daniela. Voy a poner mi presentación. Obviamente, un segundito, por favor. Ahí está. Bien, creo que ahí pueden ver ustedes la presentación. Ahí está en formato de presentación. Bueno, primero saludarlos, buenos días y buenas tardes según la zona horaria del lugar donde nos acompañan. Agradecer también a todas las personas que se han mantenido fieles a este encuentro durante toda la semana y espero que sea de aprendizaje y de inspiración para iniciar nuevas prácticas respecto a nuestra docencia. Hice un pequeño cambio en el nombre de la presentación y puse transformando las tareas basadas en desempeño, aplicando la evaluación auténtica, y ese es el tema al que me quiero referir hoy día. El año pasado yo hice una presentación que tiene una lógica similar para los que estuvieron el año pasado y tenía que ver con aplicar los principios también de la evaluación auténtica en la transformación de pruebas escritas, ¿ya? Pensando un poco que especialmente en la realidad latinoamericana las pruebas escritas son bastante comunes. Esta lógica de los certámenes, de los solemnes, son los que tienen mayor ponderación dentro de las notas y la calificación de los estudiantes al terminar un semestre. Pero tal como lo decía Sally Kay, este año, en los últimos años con la pandemia nos ha traído el desafío de construir metodologías e instrumentos de evaluación que ayuden a los estudiantes más bien a construir saber, no solamente a repetir ese saber, que era muchas veces lo que pasa en una prueba escrita con preguntas muy memorísticas, muy basadas en acumulación de contenido. Y acá, como tenemos la tormenta perfecta, diríamos, en pandemia, que significa tener celulares a mano, WhatsApp para preguntarle a un compañero, o tener Google, o las presentaciones, tenemos todo el material, y nos vemos enfrentados los docentes a decir, bueno, esto va a pasar, ellos van a conversar, ellos van a pedir ayuda, ellos van a mirar de alguna forma en Google o en sus materiales información que tienen que precisar. Entonces aprovechemos esa instancia para que ellos empiecen a desarrollar otras habilidades que no solamente tienen que ver con recordar o reconocer el conocimiento, sino que tengan que ver con construir, con evaluar, con juzgar, con investigar, ¿cierto? Con analizar información y puedan dar respuestas más bien que los representen en relación a lo creado por ellos. Y quise hacer esto, pensando en esto, quise hacer una mirada como de cómo podemos implementar con estas dimensiones que nosotros encontramos en un estudio sistemático sobre la bibliografía en evaluación auténtica, cómo podemos aplicar esas dimensiones y principios a las tareas basadas en desempeño que hoy día son tan utilizadas como lo vimos en la presentación del panel 2 en la educación en pandemia. Solamente para recordar, la evaluación auténtica no es un constructo nuevo, para nada, debe tener más de 20 años, pero siempre la evaluación auténtica ha sido una intención, ¿cierto? Ha sido esta idea de poder acercar lo que ocurre en las salas de clases con lo que realmente ocurre en el mundo real, y en educación superior traer un poco de esto del ámbito profesional, de las tareas, de las desempeños que ellos van a tener que mostrar en el ámbito laboral, traerlos a la sala de clases también, como una excusa para plantear algunos problemas que responden a la disciplina muchas veces y que el estudiante también se sienta desde que comienza una carrera parte de este mundo profesional. Muchas veces sucede que, creo que más bien en el mundo latinoamericano quizás, los estudiantes sienten que la universidad a veces es un colegio más grande, nomás, o un colegio en los primeros años, un colegio un poco más exigente, pero no vislumbran cómo aquello que están aprendiendo tributa al desempeño que ellos van a tener que tener en 5, en 4 años siguientes. Entonces, de alguna forma, la evaluación auténtica trata de hacerse cargo de esta división que muchas veces existe entre lo que nos ocurre en el mundo real y lo que tenemos que hacer cuando hacemos nuestras prácticas profesionales o ingresamos al mundo del trabajo, con lo que vemos en la sala de clases. Pareciera incluso cuando uno piensa en el sistema escolar y piensa en la prueba PISA, ¿cierto? Que en nuestro país participa en esa evaluación que también busca evaluar habilidades para la vida. La prueba PISA muchas veces los estudiantes contestan desde más el sentido común, porque las preguntas los enfrentan a algo que nunca han visto, ¿cierto? A responder cosas más bien realistas de tomar decisiones para sus presupuestos, por ejemplo, más que contenido curricular. Entonces ahí hay una decisión entre cuándo ocupo mi sentido común para responder a estas tareas que son cotidianas o realmente aplico aquello que estoy aprendiendo en la educación formal para comprender mejor y hacerme cargo de esos desafíos que tienen que ver con lo cotidiano. Entonces la autenticidad, nosotros hicimos una revisión sistemática donde participó Daniela en ese artículo, donde participó también Susan Blackson y Carola Bruna y Constanza Herrera en un artículo que fue el primero que hicimos como una revisión sistemática de la literatura, para entender un poco este concepto de autenticidad desde distintos autores y en distintos tramos de tiempo, ¿cierto? Y vemos y comprendimos en ese estudio la autenticidad basado en 3 grandes constructos. El primero, el realismo, tratando siempre de vincular la vida real, la vida profesional, lo cotidiano con lo que tenemos que aprender en la educación formal, con los contenidos que aprendemos en la educación formal. La contextualización en el sentido de traer situaciones del mundo real o situaciones evaluativas donde funcionen como excusa para aplicar el conocimiento, para obligar al estudiante a no solamente repetirlo, sino también hacer un uso creativo del conocimiento para solucionar problemas, y eso me lleva a la tercera constructo que nosotros encontramos, que fue esta idea de problematización. La evaluación auténtica, al estar situada, al buscar simular situaciones que enfrentamos cotidianamente, también nos pone frente a problemas donde tenemos que no solamente poder afrontar y resolver esos problemas repitiendo ciertos contenidos, sino también integrando diversos contenidos y creando otras posibilidades a partir de aquellos conocimientos que nosotros hemos aprendido. Es así como nosotros pudimos identificar que dentro de esta revisión sistemática existían 3 grandes dimensiones, ¿ya? El realismo, que un poco se parece a lo que he estado hablando recientemente, el desafío cognitivo, que tiene que ver con esta idea de promover en los estudiantes la transferencia, la aplicación del saber, pero también habilidades más bien de pensamiento crítico, de poder ejecutar algunas habilidades que son como desempeños cognitivos, como hacer diagnóstico, evaluaciones, críticas, o implementar algún procedimiento, o crear un producto como resultado de este trabajo de evaluación, pero también ligado a un rol del profesor que es permanente al entregar feedback, y eso significa que estamos retroalimentando a los estudiantes en su proceso de aprender, para que ellos vayan reflexionando respecto a qué es lo que el profesor quiere, o la asignatura desea que los estudiantes sean capaces de demostrar y hacer una vez que egresen de esa asignatura, por ejemplo, pero al mismo tiempo que el profesor, a través de este feedback, logre en un diálogo poder comprender también por qué los estudiantes se desempeñan de esa forma, dónde está a veces las confusiones, los errores, cómo lo podemos ayudar formativamente a ir avanzando en un aprendizaje más profundo. Entonces, voy a hablar de las tareas basadas en desempeño, porque son aquellas actividades de evaluación que no son pruebas escritas tradicionales, sino son todas aquellas actividades que nosotros les proponemos a los estudiantes para que desplieguen de manera integrada conocimientos, habilidades y actitudes, y que esto sea observable a través de un desempeño y la creación de un producto. Incorporamos en este tipo de evaluación, incorporamos diversas modalidades de evaluación, como la autoevaluación, la coevaluación, y ahí repetí autoevaluación, pero es la heteroevaluación, ¿cierto? La evaluación del profesor, la evaluación desde el propio aprendiz, y la evaluación entre pares. La idea es utilizar pautas y rúbricas para transparentar cuáles son los criterios, los indicadores de desempeño que el profesor considera necesarios para cumplir con esas tareas. Incluye a terceros en la evaluación, en el sentido que queremos también pensar para quienes es interesante lo que los alumnos están aprendiendo, y que podrían funcionar como jueces externos, no necesariamente el compañero, no necesariamente el otro grupo, no necesariamente un profesor de otra asignatura, sino podría ser, comillas, clientes o beneficiarios que desde el mundo real les interesa aprender, saber de aquello que están estudiando los estudiantes. Por ejemplo, cuando muchas veces hemos hecho capacitaciones en este tema, hemos tenido profesores del ámbito de las ingenierías, por ejemplo, y ellos nos plantean muchas veces que hacen asignaturas de microeconomía o de macroeconomía, y en ocasiones sería interesante pensar si hay, en Chile les llamamos pymes, ¿cierto? Que son empresas pequeñas, muy locales en ocasiones, pero que quizás se verían muy beneficiadas de entender cuáles son las tendencias, cuáles son los riesgos que vienen al futuro, y quizás los estudiantes podrían terminar con un tríptico entregándolo a esas empresas, o una charla a esas empresas que se beneficiarían también de lo que el alumno está aprendiendo. Y cuando el alumno además sale de la situación escolarizante, que es presentar frente a sus compañeros, sus profesores, que es lo más típicamente que tienen que hacer, y lo hacen frente a otras audiencias que vienen del mundo real y donde ellos vienen con expectativas de aprender de ellos, los estudiantes muchas veces mejoran la calidad de sus trabajos, exponen de mejor forma, utilizan un lenguaje más correcto y se sienten que están haciendo algo desde su profesión. Y por lo tanto, en este ámbito tratamos de simular condiciones realistas, entregando también productos que sean propios de la disciplina. Si en una disciplina hacemos constantemente charlas o diagnósticos, o es propio de la profesión tener buenas habilidades para comunicar y discutir, bueno, entonces es relevante que esas competencias las podamos medir a través de estas tareas basadas en desempeño. Hay distintas tareas basadas en desempeño. Normalmente nosotros trabajamos con las que aparecen acá, ¿cierto? Con debate, como métodos, un poco de evaluación centrados en el estudiante, como son los debates, los aprendizajes por proyecto, aprendizaje basado en problemas, el design thinking, o simulaciones como el ECO, el OSCE, y muchas veces estas metodologías se combinan con algún producto de presentación de esa metodología, que puede ser un póster, un portafolio, esta estrategia que se llama 3-minute thesis, que nació desde los estudiantes de doctorado, donde se presenta en 3 minutos un proyecto doctoral, pero que la podemos adaptar o ajustar a otra necesidad. El elevator pitch, que normalmente está asociado a emprendimiento, ¿cierto? Y presentar ideas o persuadir en torno a algo, que también podemos ajustarlo a otras necesidades, informes, organizadores gráficos, o como decía, trípticos, etc. ¿Qué tienen en común las tareas basadas en desempeño? Y aquí aparece Mafalda, que es un personaje argentino, ¿cierto? Una niña muy crítica y cuestionadora, ¿cierto? Bueno, tienen en común que nos enfrentan a un conflicto cognitivo. Y sabemos que de alguna forma el motor del aprendizaje, el motor de la construcción de algo nuevo tiene que ver con enfrentarnos a algo que nos desconcierta, con algo que genera cierto desequilibrio, que con los conocimientos que nosotros tenemos no podemos abordar esto y tenemos que investigar, tenemos que preguntar, tenemos que negociar con otros equipos o otros compañeros, tenemos que descubrir cosas que a veces el profesor no nos va a entregar de manera explícita en un PowerPoint, y a través del diálogo vamos desarrollando nuevos productos, nuevos aprendizajes, nuevas construcciones del saber. Entonces, esta primera dimensión a la que me quiero referir tiene que ver con el realismo, ¿cierto? Que ya la he nombrado antes. Y el realismo lo vamos a entender, pensando en la educación superior, en todas aquellas situaciones o contextos que nos traen elementos o problemas que vienen desde el mundo profesional y se enfrentan, por ejemplo, los egresados en sus primeros 5 años, o los estudiantes que se enfrentan con estos problemas en su práctica profesional, o son situaciones de la contingencia, situaciones que estamos viviendo, por ejemplo, la pandemia, y que nos hacen mirar o reflexionar respecto a algunos contenidos que vemos en nuestra profesión. Para poder pensar en el realismo, nosotros sugerimos hacernos como docentes algún tipo de preguntas. A veces nos pasa que tenemos un programa de estudio que hemos hecho durante muchos años y no lo logramos mirar con ojos nuevos, ¿cierto? Con una mirada nueva, fresca respecto a, bueno, cómo este programa nutre la formación de los estudiantes, y hacemos lo que hemos hecho permanentemente. Pero creemos nosotros que es muy importante interrogar los programas de estudio, mirarlos y tratar de revisar estos programas, estos sílabos que les dicen en otros países o en otras universidades, que nos digan, bueno, ¿qué exactamente el alumno tiene que aprender en este programa? Y por eso nos hacemos 4 preguntas. ¿Cómo este curso, cómo esta asignatura contribuye al perfil de egreso de la disciplina? ¿Cómo este curso se vincula con habilidades profesionales que son requeridas en el mundo del trabajo en esta disciplina? ¿Qué problemas típicos del mundo real requieren respuesta a través de esta asignatura, ¿cierto? Lo que aprende el estudiante en mi asignatura permite que respondan problemas, tareas o a las funciones que son más comunes en su profesión. Es decir, nosotros no estamos haciendo una asignatura estándar, ¿cierto? Estamos haciendo una asignatura que está dirigida a un público particular, que son estudiantes de una carrera. Y a veces eso se nos olvida y pensamos que la biología básica es la misma biología para un enfermero, para un kinesiólogo, para un psicólogo, para un médico. Y a veces no nos ponemos en el caso que no estamos trabajando con profesionales integrados en una misma cátedra, sino que solamente estamos haciendo esto para estudiantes de bioquímica. Y ellos necesitan una biología distinta, con ejemplos distintos, con formas de situar ese contenido de manera particular. Entonces, en la evaluación auténtica nos preocupamos que ese contexto haga alusión a estas preguntas que nos hacemos respecto al realismo. Y buscamos que ese contexto sea suficientemente rico en información para que efectivamente el alumno se pueda situar en esa realidad. Eso puede ser escrito, puede ser un caso, por ejemplo, pero también puede ser un segmento de una película, también puede ser una fotografía, también puede ser una noticia, ¿cierto? Algo que sitúa al estudiante en un lugar en particular donde el conocimiento que estamos aprendiendo lo vamos a aplicar en ese lugar para comprender ese fenómeno de otra forma, para llegar a una solución o hacer una propuesta, por ejemplo. Entonces el contexto es una situación realista y o profesional, donde hay un problema, un conflicto, hay algo que resolver, hay algo que no se entienda, hay algo que podemos colaborar con nuestro conocimiento disciplinar para abordar esa temática, la información que se presenta en ese contexto es necesaria para responder a la tarea, en este caso basada en desempeño. Se muestra en ese contexto más de una perspectiva, un fenómeno, por lo tanto no es que solamente yo tenga que acudir a mi diccionario de conocimientos que tengo sobre la asignatura, sino que necesariamente tengo que integrar conocimiento y diferenciar qué es lo que se me está pidiendo. También esta información tiene límites y restricciones, por tanto no puedo cortar y pegar conocimiento para resolverlo, sino más bien tengo que, como dije antes, mirar en perspectiva esta situación para analizarla y tomar decisión. Y como estamos hablando de tareas basadas en desempeño, una de las formas en que nosotros hemos promovido en las distintas capacitaciones que hacemos con docentes de educación superior, que el debate es una buena forma de hacerlo, es una estrategia didáctica, ¿cierto? Que no solamente se ocupa en educación universitaria, se ocupa desde educación escolar en adelante, que muchas veces en algunas áreas del saber es relevante desarrollar competencias comunicativas, persuasivas, argumentativas, entonces podemos ocuparla para desarrollar esas competencias más transversales o genéricas que tiene una carrera, pero además hacemos hincapié es que este debate no sea como típicamente hacemos debates poniendo dos temas que son, o dos posturas que son polares, y que a veces no tienen que ver con nuestra disciplina, sino que tienen que ver con la contingencia. Entonces, muchas veces se discute en los colegios, por ejemplo, y espero que un poco menos en educación superior, pero se discute sobre si estás de acuerdo con el aborto o no estás de acuerdo con el aborto, si estás de acuerdo, que son las temáticas, ¿cierto?, de nuestro país, si estás de acuerdo con el matrimonio igualitario o no estás de acuerdo, si estás de acuerdo que las parejas homosexuales adopten hijos o no, que son como las temáticas valóricas que muchas veces se ponen en debate, ¿ya? Lo que no estoy diciendo que sea malo, pero que también podemos aprovechar debates con temas que son más grises y no son tan polares y que son propios de la disciplina en la que está el alumno desarrollando su profesión, ¿cierto? Nosotros tenemos como un guión de debate, que es el que nosotros tratamos de promover, que es un poquitito más estructurado, de forma que el profesor no sienta que va a estar el semestre haciendo debates y no va a poder ver todos los temas que tiene que trabajar en el semestre. Entonces, ustedes ven que se da algunos tiempos, lo voy a dejar la página acá para que ustedes la vean en el PowerPoint, pero no me voy a referir a ella, pero se refiere que en 35 minutos uno puede ver un debate completo, ¿ya? Y no está un semestre en todo eso. Y este es un ejemplo de la asignatura de refracción clínica de la carrera de tecnología médica de la Universidad de Concepción, que fue una profesora que se capacitó en esta metodología cuando obtuvimos un proyecto muy grande desde el Ministerio de Educación. Y los profesores entonces crearon un contexto, ¿ya? La profesora en este caso creó un contexto donde era útil aplicar conocimientos que tenían que ver con esta área y con esta carrera para enfrentar un debate y llegar a una posición en este debate. El caso dice, paciente de 65 años, proveniente de Florida, que es una comuna de la 8ª región, con pensión básica solidaria en situación de riesgo social, asiste a la UAPO, que es una unidad, ¿cierto?, dentro de los SESFAM, los servicios de salud, donde usted trabaja. Consulta por mala visión PL y PC, que son términos técnicos de ello, acusando además lagrimeo al exterior y leve fotofobia. Le solicita encarecidamente lentes que solucionen su problema, ya que semanalmente asiste a un centro de madres donde realiza manualidades que le ayudan a aumentar sus ingresos económicos. El anamnesis relata diabetes mellitus descompensada, no controlando sus glicemias y manteniendo por lo general niveles de 250 mg/dL. En su historial clínico figura un pie diabético con amputación de un dedo, lo que se refleja en su lento caminar y por lo cual asiste acompañada. Esa es una situación. Además le plantean algunos datos técnicos respecto a la visión, ¿cierto?, que son típicas cosas que saben los tecnólogos médicos del área de la oftalmología, ¿cierto?, y que nosotros no vamos a saber. Y obviamente dan estas instrucciones, que se forman 2 grupos de 4 alumnos, y un grupo defiende la posición de recetar lentes, y el otro grupo defiende la posición de no recetar lentes. En el caso, hay bastantes aspectos que son interesantes, porque no es una decisión, como digo, blanco-negro, es un tema gris. Porque por un lado, la persona necesita los lentes, porque ya no le están respondiendo los lentes para la dificultad que tiene, para mantenerse, porque tiene que hacer estas manualidades, pero por otro lado, al parecer la persona tiene un bajo autocuidado respecto a la salud y la diabetes ha explotado, ¿cierto? Y probablemente los lentes les sirvan por un tiempo y bueno, nuevamente dejen de funcionar porque la diabetes tiene un impacto en la visión. Entonces aquí aparece un poco quién habla primero, que después, las preguntas, etc. Aquí hay otro ejemplo que no lo voy a leer por el tiempo, pero es de la carrera de Derecho de la Universidad del Desarrollo y aparece nuevamente un caso donde hay una situación que se plantea que entra alguien a robar y rompe una ventana en una casa de playa, ¿ya? Entonces el profesor pone dos posiciones dentro de un grupo debatiente. Uno tiene que sostener que la casa de veraneo debe ser tratada como lugar destinado a la habitación, y el otro grupo debe proponer que la casa de veraneo debe ser tratada como lugar no habitado. Y para, obviamente, los que saben un poco más de derecho, este caso, siempre en rigor los abogados lo que buscan es establecer como la calificación la valoración jurídica o la calificación jurídica del caso, porque eso va a impactar en la pena, ¿cierto? Entonces ahí hay mucho de interpretación de la ley. Quiero ir a la segunda dimensión, que en este caso tiene que ver con el desafío cognitivo. Seguramente los que vinieron el año pasado han escuchado un poco hablar de este modelo de 3 dimensiones. Y esta dimensión de desafío cognitivo lo que trata de presentar es decir, bueno, en la evaluación auténtica queremos un poco avanzar desde las habilidades más de reconocimiento y de recuerdo de la información a habilidades más de análisis y de transferencia. Entonces, en general hay muchos autores que plantean que en la medida que nosotros desafiamos a los estudiantes en utilizar habilidades más de nivel analítico y de transferencia, los estudiantes aprenden más profundamente y la estabilidad del recuerdo del aprendido es mayor. Y otro dato de la causa es que los alumnos no aprenden a analizar y transferir el conocimiento, aplicar el conocimiento, utilizarlo, criticarlo, etcétera, que son las habilidades más complejas, solamente porque uno madura, es decir, madura en términos de que crece en edad o avanza en cursos, sino que son habilidades que se tienen que intencionadamente trabajar en la sala de clases, modelar, discutir en la sala de clases sobre estos temas, porque es algo que se desarrolla, ¿ya? Que es algo que se desarrolla a través de ejercicios, a través de evaluaciones, a través de cátedras que modelan estas habilidades. Incluso Susan Bloxham, coautora de este paper inicial que les hablé, dentro de los textos que ella ha construido, hay una cita que nosotros utilizamos, que es esta idea que muchas veces un estudiante es capaz de tener un 7, la mejor nota, 7 es la nota más alta, en un certamen, una prueba, porque fue capaz de reproducir conocimientos de manera descontextualizada, es decir, repetir aquello que está escrito en el cuaderno, en los PowerPoint o en un artículo, pero que sea capaz de hacer eso y que pueda tener la mejor nota porque no le faltó una coma y fue una respuesta literal respecto a lo que se estaba pidiendo, eso no garantiza que el alumno pueda utilizar ese conocimiento en la vida real para resolver el problema. Entonces, cuando llega el momento de aplicarlo en la práctica y no responder qué es A, qué es B, sino que tener que utilizarlo para diagnosticar a alguien, por ejemplo, eso no necesariamente pasa de manera directa, ¿ya? Es algo que se ejercita, que se trabaja. Y en ese sentido, nosotros pensamos, como se dijo antes en la presentación anterior, que mucho de lo que nosotros nos guía la enseñanza y el aprendizaje, en la enseñanza y la evaluación son los resultados de aprendizaje, ¿cierto? Sabemos que los resultados de aprendizaje tienen, y esto lo voy a trabajar más en un panel que viene la próxima semana, ¿cierto? Se trata de que los estudiantes muestren lo que van a ser capaces de hacer una vez que aprendieron algo en una unidad, o en una asignatura, o en una carrera. Y esos resultados de aprendizaje, como decía Sally y Kay, tienen un verbo infinitivo, y que es un verbo de acción, ¿cierto? Que muestra el despliegue de una habilidad. Y ese verbo nos indica cierta complejidad, ¿ya? Nosotros hemos revisado muchas taxonomías y nos hemos quedado con una organización nuestra de 3 niveles, ¿cierto? En un primer nivel hablamos de todos aquellos resultados de aprendizaje y verbos de acción que definen o involucran habilidades de bajo orden, que podríamos decir que son más del recuerdo y el reconocimiento, como definir, describir, nombrar, listar, seleccionar, por ejemplo. Otras habilidades cognitivas que son más bien para manejar información, que nosotros decimos que un poco cuando los estudiantes tienen que masticar el conocimiento, implica habilidades de nivel 2 que llamamos, que son por ejemplo calcular, analizar, relacionar, examinar, argumentar, debatir, deducir, y habilidades de nivel 3 que son más bien de transferencia, donde el estudiante despliega un desempeño cognitivo y transfiere el conocimiento, por ejemplo, cuando tiene que construir, crear, diseñar, decidir, evaluar, criticar, juzgar, innovar, por ejemplo. Evidentemente, para poder argumentar o debatir o deducir que son habilidades del nivel 2, yo necesito tener conocimiento, ¿cierto? Y obviamente hago uso de mis habilidades de nivel 1, como describir y definir. Sin embargo, y es algo que tratamos siempre de explicitar, que la memoria es un medio para aprender, y el que nosotros podamos definir algo o enumerarlo, significa que hemos logrado cierto aprendizaje, pero no es el fin del aprendizaje. El aprendizaje implica poder hacer uso de ese conocimiento. Y por eso las habilidades que nosotros hemos categorizado como de nivel 3 son lo que implica o el para qué del aprendizaje. Nosotros aprendemos para después poder construir algo, o diseñarlo, o intervenir, o evaluar, o solucionar. Pero ese es el fin del aprendizaje. Cuando nosotros en el mundo del trabajo no nos van a preguntar, argumente en torno a las diferencias de, o describa esto, sino que nos van a pedir hacer un diagnóstico, tomar una decisión o hacer una sugerencia profesional. Entonces, una de las metodologías que podemos ocupar, que son como tareas basadas en desempeño, son el aprendizaje basado en problemas. Ya que aparece un poco lo que es el APB, ¿cierto? Que tiene de investigación, de trabajo en equipo, de presentación de productos y de desarrollo de competencias. Y este es un ejemplo de la asignatura de bioquímica, particularmente de la carrera de bioingeniería de la Universidad de Concepción, de una profesora que estuvo en la capacitación. Es un ejemplo un poco añejo, porque es el caso de los mineros, ¿cierto? Que yo creo que ya ha pasado como 10 años desde que esto ocurrió. Y esta es una noticia que apareció en el diario, donde hubo mineros que quedaron atrapados en una mina de carbón en el norte de Chile y estuvieron bastante tiempo atrapados y con pocas posibilidades de estar vivos, pero hubo un buen trabajo y pudieron ellos salir todos con vida y no hubo, ¿cómo se dice?, muertes que lamentar. Y este es el ejemplo, esta es una noticia del diario Textual, dice, los 33 mineros atrapados hace 18 días al interior de una mina en el norte de Chile sobrevivieron con 2 cucharadas de atún y medio vaso de leche cada 48 horas. Según explicó la senadora por la región de Atacama, donde se encuentra el yacimiento, comillas, tuve la oportunidad de ver la recepción de la segunda paloma, cápsula que se envía al fondo de la mina a través de sondaje, con las fichas médicas de cada uno. Fue emocionante ver cómo llegaban un gran rollo enviado por cada uno de ellos, señaló Isabel Allende. Los equipos médicos contactaron este lunes con los mineros atrapados a 700 metros de profundidad y pudieron constatar que se encuentran en buen estado de salud, según confirmó la doctora Paula Newman, a cargo de la atención médica del rescate. Los mineros recibieron este lunes una solución glucosada al 5% y un comprimido de omeprazol, un medicamento para revestir el estómago para evitar las posibles úlceras de estrés por la falta de alimentación de todos estos días. De momento deberán esperar por lo menos un día más antes de recibir alimentos sólidos. Ese fue el caso que la profesora le entregó a los estudiantes, solo eso. Ya la profesora tenía un buen manejo de lo que es el APB, y eso significa que tenía tutores que trabajaban en el aula con los grupos de estudiantes, Y era un trabajo que claramente se desarrollaba en aula y fuera de aula, donde los estudiantes tenían que investigar y tratar de descubrir por qué la profesora había puesto ese ejemplo, qué es lo que tenían que investigar, cuáles son las habilidades que tenían que desplegar. Entonces tenía 4 sesiones, con distintas sesiones presenciales y además 4 horas semanales destinadas al estudio independiente, donde ellos tenían que identificar el problema, asignar tareas, reportar hallazgos, resolucionar el problema y después presentar resultados. Eran grupos de 6 a 8 integrantes, había un líder, un moderador, un secretario, que eran asignados al azar al inicio de cada sesión y que se cambiaban sesión por sesión. Había un tutor que los acompañaba y le respondía a dudas, y la idea era no limitarse a la conclusión, sino tratar de entender el proceso a través del cual los estudiantes llegaban a la solución del problema. La labor del tutor tenía que ver con, ellos recibían una guía, los tutores que iban como apoyando a los grupos en sus discusiones y en sus investigaciones, pero esta guía que tenía el tutor no la tenían los estudiantes y el tutor no la entregaba a los estudiantes, sino que era lo que él sabía que se esperaba lograr en los estudiantes, entonces toda su comunicación con ellos iba gatillando esa búsqueda de esa información. El tema del trabajo, que no lo sabían los estudiantes, tenía que ver con la relación entre nutrición y salud, metabolismo en inanición. Ellos tenían que descubrir cómo eran las fuentes de energía en hipoglicemia y en ayuno prolongado, cómo se degradan las macromoléculas, cómo hay síntesis de cuerpos cetónicos, qué pasa con la alimentación y la salud. Bien. Y vamos a pasar ahora a la tercera dimensión, que es el feedback, ¿ya? Como tengo la presentación abierta, no sé si Daniela me puedes decir cuánto me falta, o ya estoy en el tiempo. No te escucho.
Disculpa, son las 17:24.
Ya, ¿y la es hasta?
Es que era hasta las 17:20, pero como partimos un poco más tarde, deben quedar unos 3 minutos por ahí.
Ya, eso justamente es más o menos lo que me queda. Bien, y la tercera dimensión tiene que ver con el feedback, ¿cierto? Que tiene que ver con toda la información que nosotros le entregamos al estudiante como docentes, que compartimos y discutimos con los estudiantes respecto a su desempeño y aprendizaje. Es un diálogo entre el profesor y los estudiantes donde se busca, por un lado, el docente busca comprender por qué los estudiantes se desempeñan de esa forma, ¿cierto? Cuáles son los errores que cometen, cuáles son las confusiones que se van presentando, pero los estudiantes también buscan cómo acceder a la mente del profesor, ¿cierto? Tratar de saber, bueno, qué es lo que el profesor quiere con estas actividades, porque en general las tareas basadas en desempeño tienen de conflicto, tienen algo como de no completud, y no es que no se espera que el profesor entregue toda la información, sino que ellos investiguen, estudian, descubran, ¿cierto? Vayan más allá y por eso no hay una sola respuesta, sino que hay varias respuestas posibles y que son correctas dependiendo de cuáles son los argumentos, las investigaciones y las decisiones profesionales y técnicas que fueron tomando. Y este feedback no solamente ocurre al final del proceso, sino ocurre en distintos momentos del proceso, y la idea es que ellos puedan ir mejorando su desempeño y teniendo la opción de entregar el mejor desempeño posible. Entonces, los pilares del feedback tienen que ver con reconocer fortaleza, poder descubrir errores y entregar consejos para mejorar. ¿Ya? No sirve de nada hacer un buen diagnóstico de cuál es el problema y qué es lo que se hizo bien, sino estamos mostrando cómo se puede mejorar concretamente. Eso es lo que muchas veces necesitan los estudiantes. Existen distintos tipos de feedback, ¿cierto? Desde lo más correctivo, a lo más descriptivo, a lo más dialógico, pero toda la literatura en el último tiempo ha mostrado que el feedback es una relación dialógica, que está centrada en construir conocimiento, por tanto está centrada en poder descubrir qué están haciendo, qué están comprendiendo los estudiantes frente a un fenómeno, y está centrada en el desarrollo de la capacidad de autorregulación, es decir, que ellos aprendan de la experiencia y que puedan ir tomando buenas decisiones para trabajos futuros. Y, como decía, se entregan distintos momentos, antes de la evaluación, durante la evaluación y después de la evaluación, ¿cierto? Antes de la evaluación, tratando de clarificar todo el instrumento, la metodología que se va a ocupar, pero también resaltando esa disposición para aprender de los estudiantes, durante la evaluación tratando de ir evaluando entregas en proceso, ¿cierto? Y después de la evaluación también facilitando en los estudiantes la toma de perspectiva, la capacidad de reflexión y autocrítica. Y aquí tengo un ejemplo de aprendizaje basado en proyectos, que es en una asignatura de investigación cuantitativa en la carrera de Psicología de la Universidad del Desarrollo, y donde este aprendizaje trata de, entregando un contexto, que los alumnos lleven a cabo un proyecto, ¿cierto? Como bastante profesional respecto a lo que ellos probablemente hacen en el mundo del trabajo. Y se entrega un contexto, en este caso es muy cortito, lo voy a leer, dice: la evaluación del clima escolar involucra la relación del profesor con el alumno al interior del aula. La literatura plantea que el vínculo entre alumno y su profesor se convierte en una segunda oportunidad de establecer relaciones de apego y confianza extraparentales para los estudiantes. Una relación positiva entre profesores y alumnos influye en A, la mejora de los resultados académicos de los estudiantes; B, la reducción de desórdenes del comportamiento; C, incremento de las competencias sociales y emocionales; D, mayor compromiso y motivación para aprender; e incluso E, mejora la asistencia en clase. Considerando esto, el Ministerio de Educación en el año 2015 le encarga una investigación para profundizar en esta variable, solicitando un estudio diagnóstico y la evaluación de una intervención piloto en una muestra de 6 colegios públicos de la quinta región. Entonces, recordemos que es una asignatura más de investigación cuantitativa, entonces los estudiantes lo que deben hacer, o lo que al menos inicialmente se les entrega, que ellos al menos tienen que tratar de responder, es hacer una propuesta de diagnóstico, determinando el tipo de diagnóstico que van a hacer, la selección de los instrumentos, la selección del procedimiento de muestreo participante, las propuestas de protocolo de aplicación de instrumentos considerando aspectos éticos, el plan de análisis de datos y la planificación temporal y presupuestaria. Y luego, algo muy parecido, pero para evaluar el impacto de esta intervención piloto, cuál fue su efectividad, su impacto, determinar qué tipo de evaluación van a hacer de efectividad o impacto, con qué instrumentos van a ocupar, cómo van a seleccionar a la muestra, cómo van a establecer protocolos de aplicación de instrumentos considerando los aspectos éticos, plan de análisis de datos y planificación temporal y presupuestaria. Entonces los estudiantes en grupo entregaron un informe con este estudio y trabajo que hicieron en relación a este contexto que es profesionalizante y donde muy probable ellos en la vida real tengan que hacer proyectos de esta naturaleza para intervenciones en el área educacional, organizacional, social comunitaria, etc. ¿Cómo uno decide qué tarea basada en desempeño va a utilizar? Obviamente hay que guiarse por el resultado de aprendizaje, que es la brújula, ¿cierto? Es lo que nos orienta respecto a esta alineación curricular entre enseñanza y evaluación, orientados de este resultado de aprendizaje. También el contenido, evidentemente también es un factor a analizar, el tiempo que dispongo para hacer este tipo de evaluaciones. Podemos combinar distintas tareas basadas en desempeño. Las tareas basadas en desempeño pueden ser abordadas de manera individual o grupal, tradicionalmente es de manera grupal. Y evidentemente tenemos que tener evaluación formativa de proceso y feedback permanente para llegar a un buen puerto. Les quiero agradecer. Evidentemente en estas tareas basadas en desempeño la idea es aplicar el modelo de evaluación auténtica con sus principios de realismo, desafío cognitivo y feedback, y por eso di ejemplos en los 3 ámbitos, separados por temas didácticos, pero obviamente en cada una de estas tareas basadas en desempeño nos damos cuenta que estamos aplicando los 3 principios. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en la ronda de preguntas.
Muchas gracias, Verónica, por tu interesante presentación. Nos da como muchas luces de cómo aplicar la evaluación auténtica en este tipo de instrumentos. Y continuamos entonces con la ponencia de la doctora Rola Ayawi, que nos presenta el tema ¿Auténtica para quién? Experiencias de los estudiantes sobre evaluación auténtica. La doctora Rola Ayawi es profesora asociada de investigación educativa en el Centro de Investigación en Evaluación y Aprendizaje Digital Cradle de la Universidad de Deakin de Australia. Tiene una licenciatura con honores en fisioterapia y trabajó como fisioterapeuta y educadora clínica antes de pasar a la academia a tiempo completo con la finalización de su doctorado en el 2007. Desde entonces ha dirigido un programa de investigación centrado en el aprendizaje integrado, en el trabajo con interés en inclusión, evaluación y retroalimentación en el lugar de trabajo. Tiene más de 80 publicaciones que incluyen artículos de revista revisadas por pares, capítulos de libros y libros. Estimada Rola, puedes comenzar.
Fabulous. Thank you, Daniela. Let me just share my screen and then you'll have my undivided attention. Great. So I trust you can see that and you can hear me. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me, Veronica and Daniela as well this morning, for making me feel welcomed. So I think my talk has been set up really well with thanks to the previous speakers, but I'm going to take a very different perspective in the sense that I'm going to focus on, once we've designed assessment, authentic assessment, as we've heard, do students experience it as authentic? So who determines what is and isn't authentic? So that's going to be the gist of my talk, and I'm really going to try and hopefully convince you that it's really important that the students also perceive assessment to be authentic to them and their aspirations and what they're doing. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge the team who did this research with me, Dr. Joanna Tai and Prof. David Bowd, who are at Cradle, Nia Tran, who worked with us as the research officer, Professor Liz Johnson, also at Deakin DVC Education, and Carol Joy Patrick from Griffith University. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the lands on which I am in, and take a moment for us to reflect on country as we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed. Let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. I'd like to in particular acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the lands of the Eora Nation and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. So I'm going to start by setting the scene around authentic assessment, and I really don't need to spend a lot of time doing that because it's been done so beautifully already. I'm going to present to you the research we did and maybe some alternative perspectives in which we can not so much as radically change our thinking, but perhaps to extend our thinking around authentic assessment. And I'm really going to spend a little bit of time at the end, perhaps suggesting some practical suggestions for assessment design. I'd like to thank Dave for a couple of these preliminary slides as well. You may have seen them before, but I really like this slide with this cartoon here from HR. I see you did well in school, but what real world skills do you have? And the candidate says, tests, I can take tests. And that's really one of the biggest impetuses for changing our assessment practices, because many students perceive traditional assessment tasks as arbitrary and irrelevant. They don't make for effective learning, and there's no intention of maintaining the knowledge for the long term. And as you've heard already, some students don't see the point of the assessment. They see them more as artificial exercises, as jumping through hoops. Oh, I've just got to do this to get the marks and get through. So there is often not enough alignment with the world of practice, and it's uninteresting to take and uninteresting for us to mark. And the thing about it being uninteresting is that students disengage and don't really use it as a learning experience. And if I draw from what Sally and Kay were saying around the need for getting students to engage, to strengthen their belonging, to promote students' success, but also to empower them to be productive members of society and orient them to society, as Jan MacArthur would say, through assessment. The benefits are many, and here are just a few. It's about quality and depth of learning, the development of higher order skills. It's about empowering students, improving their autonomy, their self-determination, which tends to promote their commitment and motivation for learning, promote self-regulation capacity, metacognition, and self-reflection are some of the things that research has identified as the benefits for authentic assessment. And here again are some things that you've seen already today, the dimensions of authentic assessment, and I draw from the work of Veronica here, who did a literature review to look at the ways in which authentic assessment it can be conceptualized, that can help us in the way we can design authentic assessment. And while there's many frameworks for, or dimensions, if you like, for authentic assessment, I really do think these three are very useful to think about. First, that there's realism in the task itself. So it's linked to everyday life and work. So not only does it approximate contexts of the discipline or the world out there, but also it cognitively challenges the students. So it prompts the development of higher order thinking, whether that's through self-regulation of learning or metacognition, and of course that very important higher order thinking of evaluative judgment. And if you were at panel 3, you would have heard Sadler talking about the coming to know of what good quality looks like and the making of judgment. Now, he called it monitoring and control. In his talk, in his papers, he referred to the notion of evaluative connoisseurship. And in our own work, we've put forward the notion of evaluative judgment, which all comes to that idea of we need to help students understand what quality looks like, because we can't be there for them throughout their life, and nor do we want to be, nor do they want us to be. That it comes to a point where they have to make their own judgments about their practices in specific contexts to determine what the right thing is to do at that particular time. Now, what we've talked a lot about today is how we as teachers, educators, and researchers design authentic assessment. Really, this research came about from a simple question, which was, do the students see it as authentic? It's all well and good for us to design it, but do they accept it as real? And so students, when we looked at the literature to try and work out whether they did or didn't, it struck us that there wasn't a lot of research on student experiences per se, but there was this study. It was a quantitative study, and what it showed was that students' perceptions of alignment and authenticity of assessment came up as the strongest contributors to the attainment of generic outcomes influencing their engagement. Let me break it down for you. And by the way, when I use will, what I'm talking about, I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. So I hope that's the case. Please let me know. What I'm talking about here, and Smith and Worsfold are talking about, is will, work integrated learning. So that's any kind of unit that tries to integrate ideas around work into learning. But what they found was a really strong contributor to student learning is how they experienced alignment and authenticity. And really, this probably shouldn't have come as much of a surprise, because we do spend a lot of time thinking about constructive alignment when we design our curricula. And for many of you, this will be very familiar. Constructive alignment being what we do is that there's alignment between the goals of the educational program, the activities, the teaching and learning activities you design, and the assessment. That's the alignment component. And we do spend a lot of time as educators, for example, blueprinting, mapping out that things are aligned, that we're assessing all our learning outcomes, and there's no surprises in the assessment. But there's a really important word in there, which is that constructive bit. And the constructive is about this alignment being something the learners have to create for themselves. So the students need to be able to see the alignment. And similarly, we argue here is that students need to be able to see the authenticity. So this led us to this research question. How do students experience alignment and authenticity between their work-integrated learning placement and their own expectations, and how they are assessed? So I'd like to at this stage acknowledge the funders for this work, who are ASIN, the Australian Collaborative Education Network. They are the WIL community, if you like, here in Australia. So what we did some qualitative research, which is what I enjoy doing, and we did that across 2 universities. We had 14 students, and we looked across tightly or loosely coupled placements. This was something that we designed ourselves in terms of thinking about sampling. You probably don't need to worry about it so much, but the tightly coupled are those professional ones where there's regulation, there's very clear pathways like becoming a teacher, becoming a physio, becoming a doctor, versus the loosely coupled, or an engineer, versus the loosely coupled, which are those that perhaps are more ephemeral or broad-based, such as, for example, doing English or arts or commerce or philosophy, where there isn't that strong professional regulation, but of course it's still a professional degree and a discipline. So what we did, we started by getting the students to draw their experiences of learning in the placement, and then we gave them a different color, and we asked them to draw what they thought was captured by the assessment. And I'll show you some student drawings in a second. This is an approach that has been used before, and then what we did is we used the drawing to elicit their thoughts about learning and assessment using semi-structured interviews. We also did some document analysis of the units of study guide, including the rubrics, the assessment instructions, and the assessment tasks, for us to make some judgments around authenticity based on our understandings of dimensions of authenticity, to triangulate basically what the students were saying themselves, and we overall analysed it thematically, but we also took each student to be a case study in and of themselves, because to try and understand more deeply what was going on. So just in case you were wondering about the assessment structure, so most of these placements had a very similar assessment structure. There was a learning plan, an articulation of goals. This is similar to a learning contract where students might put in some of their own personal goals, what they want to achieve from doing the placement, and that is theoretically at least monitored over the placement. There was reflection on workplace activities and learning. Students could submit artifacts that they had designed in their placements, such as lesson plans, projects, plans. What else did we have? A variety of things. And then plus or minus assessment and feedback from the industry supervisor. So it gave a lot of scope in that for the student to put in a little bit of themselves into the work. Interestingly, what we identified and what the students told us is that whilst there were many alignments between the assessment and their learning activities and goals, there were 3 key misalignments. Told us that in their experience, some of the assessment activities didn't really align with who they wanted to become, their image of their future selves. And this is a bit along the lines of what Sally and Kay were talking about, that holistic understanding of authentic assessment, of what the student brings as their whole self into it. And so the assessment task in some ways needs to be able to They need to be able to reflect them in it. They need to be able to see their future developing identity within the assessment. There was a misalignment between placement activities and assessment activities, and this is because of the very emergent nature of placement activities. Things come up that you can't always plan for, and also because in general the assessment activities captured a very narrow range of competencies, and I'll show you that in a second. And then there was a misalignment between the university and industry role and practice. And really what's common across all of these 3 misalignments is one where, if you think about the triad involved in authentic assessment, you have the student, you have the educators, the university educators, and then you have the industry understanding and the industry people, roles and practices. And so when there was a gap between any of those sorts of 3 key stakeholders, that led to a sense of rupturing of constructive alignment for the student. So let's look at an example, and I'll talk through each of the 3 misalignments in turn here to try and explain them more fully. So here we see a drawing from a student who was doing a public health, I think, placement, and in purple the student drew her teaching and learning activities and what she got into and what she did during the placement. And you've probably already guessed, in the green what we see is what the assessment captured, and there's really no overlap in this drawing. So the student got to the initial role that the student was meant to be doing was about being a research assistant at this disability centre, but instead what she ended up working as was helping patients with disability therapy through riding horses. And so here we see her in that very big picture at the front, grooming the horses. In the back, in the pen, she is working with the patients with disabilities, working with the therapist who's alongside and pulling the horse, and talking with the various people who are part of that network, right? What we also see is that she did do some work around compiling surveys, and also in terms of data entry and assessments on patients with disabilities. However, when we look at what the assessment was doing, the assessment tried to capture personal and professional development, but she was isolated, sitting in front of her desk, feeling like it didn't really connect with the experiences that she'd had, and that it was very theoretical. And here we see the first rupture in terms of authenticity, right? And that's because a lot of students, in fact all the students, perceive the value of assessment, its authenticity, in relation to their future selves. And while they were doing all these amazing things as workers in the placement. When they sat down to do the assessment, it very much positioned them within a student role. Here, there's a quote on the right, and this is actually a positive quote. This is a student who said, I felt like this is about the assessment, just really more industry-based assessments. So they were really relevant, and it's actually stuff that we can go out and use ongoing beyond our degree. The resume, even the journal document stuff, working with clients, they're actually industry-related skills. So I'm not saying that the assessment was entirely misaligned or entirely fully aligned, but in some parts it was and in some parts it wasn't. And in this case, for this particular student, there was also the other parts of the assessment, which was doing a resume, for example, doing the journal document, that she felt was actually did align with her future self and industry-related skills. This is another example. This is showing the narrow range of competencies that are assessed by our assessment practices. Again, here the student shows in blue a lot of the skills she learned: answering phones, talking to not just her supervisor but other supervisors, answering client emails, completing SWOT analyses, sitting in board meetings, focused on a narrow part of communication, because all of it was written assessment. And so there was this intense focus on showing how, on communication via written medium, without actually looking at some of the more verbal communication that was going on live in the placement. Now you might say, well, but they're still getting the student to reflect on their verbal communication. But I would give you a note of caution around reflective assessments as a summative tool, which is that what it shows is the student can write reflectively as they expect the educators from them, using a particular model that may or may not be provided. It doesn't actually show that the student can do the thing itself. What it shows is that they can reflect on the thing, not necessarily do it. And so here that narrow range of competencies comes through, and perhaps what we need there is somehow capturing the real verbal interactions alongside the reflections on the verbal interactions. And that's what the students were saying. So this is an example of some misalignments between the practical activities and assessment activities that led to instrumentalism. So the student would be really engaged, or tell us they'd be really engaged in the placement, but when it came to writing the reflective writing on their own, away from the placement, for some students it was just like, right, let's just get this task done. They want us to do this. I'm just going to write a few things about, what happened. So it led to some instrumentalism. Again, there's another quote from another student here on the right. The rubric for my assessment is very much focused on our understanding of the structure of a lesson plan and what needs to be in a lesson plan to teach an effective lesson, rather than how we actually personally taught it and how we found the lesson plan either stayed the same or changed during the lesson. So the students are actually really savvy. They're making really nuanced judgments about the quality of the assessment. They're saying, well, they made me do a lesson plan for the assessment, and that's great because it's authentic. It's moving towards authenticity, right? Because it's capturing a real artifact of practice. But it doesn't go far enough, according to this student, because it doesn't show that adaptation, the improvisation that happens when you're in a classroom with students and the plan goes awry. Now, they might be able to reflect on it after, but you don't know you don't know, you can't see the actual doing in the classroom by bookending these assignments. Now, I'm not suggesting we have to see everything, but I think there's value in doing a bit more of that. This last one here again is from a teacher, so a tightly coupled unit, and the teacher, the learning is in green, and the student is giving a talk to the students. And what you see, I particularly like, I don't know if you can see my little marker here on the left bottom hand corner, there's a little kid who's crying, and the student teacher is trying to comfort that little kid. And the question is, how do we capture that live interaction and see the actual empathy that's being portrayed and the emotional skills involved? And perhaps one way to do that, other than written reflection, which is limited in its ability to capture the tacit, the tacit qualities of practice, of quality practice. Here we see her talking with her supervisor or preceptor who would give her feedback on her skills. And you might say, well, that's great because she's getting feedback from the supervisor out there on the clinical placement. And yes, again, if we think about authenticity, moving towards authenticity, not as a destination, but as a continuum, I agree with you wholeheartedly. But what was really interesting in this example that undermined authenticity was that the educator wasn't allowed, the educator's report did not contribute to the mark. It was merely a report on performance. Now, why did the university do that? There is actually some beautiful research by Denise Jackson that shows that usually clinical placement supervisors tend to be very kind, and so they are overgenerous with their marks according to the university standards. So here what we see is an undermining of the validity in the eyes of the student because the compromise was made towards strengthening reliability of the assessment. And I would argue that assessment design is always, of course, a compromise, but perhaps the educational stance is more important in some assessments than reliability. The psychometricians might disagree. So here the last misalignment is one between industry and practice. I'm just looking at my time here. So what we see in that example is a mismatch, as well as other things that students told us about here is a mismatch between what they were taught at the university and how it was practiced at the workplace. What was interesting to me here, let me give you a quick example. In medicine, for example, we teach students how to wash their hands in order to have clean hands. Now, when they go out into placement, they see all sorts of different ways of washing hands, which isn't necessarily as strict and rigorous as what they saw at university. Now, you could argue that the hospital staff are cutting corners, or in fact, you could see it as a local contextualization depending on this type of patients. So if you haven't touched anything, you've merely been in a room and you move on to the next patient, perhaps a quick wash is what is needed versus a surgical wash of hands. So the students need to learn these local enactments and variability in practice based on context, but they weren't necessarily savvy enough to get that without having a conversation with someone. And what they often did was then discount the way it was done at university, because that's not the real world. What matters is the real world. And assessment, they saw assessment as very much being university driven with very little input from the industry people, and that also undermined the authenticity of the assessment, leading to cynicism. And one more quote here, the way we're taught to document at university and then you go out into the workplace, it's like not necessarily the same at all. So that's frustrating when you're getting assessed at uni and you've got to tick these boxes, but it's like that's not even the way they do it in the real world. And that's, you know, this shows how we really need to do that bridging work between uni and practice to help students understand that knowledge is not black and white, that we do need to make those local adaptations and the reasons that we do that. And so when assessment is merely assessing them on the way things are done at university rather than the way things are done in practice, that can also lead to undermining of authenticity, leading to cynicism. So let me wrap this all up for you. What we see and what I hope I've shown is that assessment tools can work as demarcations, defining good practice and legitimate learning. Now, these demarcations risk being disconnected from the everyday practice and hence risk decoupling the assessment tool and the participants' everyday practice, leading to instrumentalism and ticking boxes. Let me reword that for you. Basically, what it's saying is, what I'm saying is, because that's from different research, what we found is that students also make relatively nuanced judgments about how authentic an assessment is. And if they think the assessment is not resonating with who they want to become, with the learning activities that they see out there in the real world, with the ways in which industry does things, then it can risk decoupling the assessment from everyday practice, leading to instrumentalism and let's just get through this as another hurdle. And what happens is there's a rupture of authenticity. Okay. So what did we add by doing this research? Well, we showed that assessment overall depicts very individual. Sorry, I'm hearing leading to assessment is individual, is narrow, and it leads to capturing of narrow competencies, often written competencies. That students' constructive alignment contributes to authenticity of the assessment, that students want the assessment to reflect their achievements and developing identity. They want it to show what they can actually do in real time. So how can I reframe this in a way that perhaps helps us in the design? Well, one of the things we can think about assessment is as a boundary object, a bridging between what happens at the university and practice. Now, what we do at the university can never be the same because the contexts are different. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that we need to be in full alignment. I actually don't think that's possible. But what we should be doing perhaps is using those ruptures, those moments of misalignment to ask about, why did that happen? Is it something to do with the design, or is it a learning experience we can use to try and explain local adaptations and improvisations that happen between these two communities? So assessment will position the student within a student role. That's what it does when it's summative. However, can it also allow them to project that future image of themselves within the assessment? And I do believe that authentic assessment is very much on a continuum. So don't let me discourage you. It is not a final destination, but it's about continuously questioning whether we're moving towards that more authentic end of the spectrum, but not just authentic for us, but authentic to the students. And that requires negotiation amongst the various stakeholders. So if I can add, and sorry, Veronica, to meddle with your 3 dimensions, but I would add students' perceptions of alignment and authenticity to check in on those misalignments, because they can undermine authenticity. I would add that as another dimension of assessment, authentic assessment. So how can we do that? How can we move in an authentic direction? Well, I think there's a number of ways. You can, firstly, we have to design it in. And if you're really radical, we can co-design it in, and that's even better. But without scaring you too much, perhaps we can start from existing tasks and shift them towards authenticity. And we had some beautiful examples already this morning about that. Alternatively, we start with authentic examples in practice and see how those can be adapted, trying to explain the local context of the university and how that differs and how that changes the ways perhaps the practice happens. But then there's a necessary next step, which is to ask students about their perspectives of what constitutes authenticity, whether that's after they've done the assessment or whether that's in the explanation of the assessment, in the bringing students to understand what is expected, in allowing choice for students, in allowing open negotiation. And I think I've probably already said this. So some ways of encouraging student construction of alignment or voice in our assessment design is to open up opportunities for students to negotiate assessment tasks and to fluidly revise these. So although we saw evidence of learning contracts, these were set at the beginning of the placement and never revisited. That's not their point. To encourage students to reflect on, and choice, by the way, choice is another way of building in student voice. Encourage students to reflect on alignments and misalignments which offer opportunities for learning. So if they're going out on placement, to come back from placement and talk about how did what you learned at university differ from what happened out there in the real world. And that helps you in terms of designing future assessments to get a sense and to continue to evolve the assessment. And the assessment privileges the developing of professional identities. And this is a more tricky one, and we need to perhaps in future research spend a bit of time understanding the ways in which assessment influences professional identity, but also the ways in which it might undermine the development of professional identities, leading to that notion of ticking boxes, instrumentalism and cynicism. So just to finish, authentic assessment is not a destination. It's a continuum. There are multiple dimensions and there's also multiple audiences. And if we think of our trifecta, the university was what we talked about earlier, staff's perceptions of designing authenticity. I talked about the students. There's a whole nother kettle of fish. I don't think that's the right metaphor. There's a whole nother bucket of stakeholders who are the industry people out there. And I'd be curious to know if they looked at our assessments, whether they think they're authentic. So there's something about negotiating shared quality within that. And it doesn't have to be too laborious. So for example, can we involve industry partners in moderation activities? Can we involve them in rubric creation? Can we give them a legitimate task in the assessment beyond writing a brief report because we don't think their scores are reliable enough? Whilst we definitely need to design authentic assessment, I think authenticity is in the eye of the beholder, and it's something that that students need to experience themselves. And if they don't, the question is what do they think could have been done to make it more authentic? And finally, authentic assessment does matter because it equips students for the future around specific knowledge and skills. but also it informs their capacity to make informed decisions about their own practice. And that's what we're trying to do here. So here's a guide, a practical guide that we developed as a result of this research. It is a lot more practical than my talk, perhaps. It's also open access. And this is the paper. If you want to look at it in more depth, we do talk about the theoretical perspectives in a bit more depth. And we talk about that notion of compromise in assessment design and the need that assessment design always involves compromise. And I believe that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Let me just stop that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Rola, por tu presentación. Creo que también es necesario mirar la evaluación auténtica desde la perspectiva de los estudiantes. Es un tema muy importante. Y ahora vamos a comenzar con la ronda de preguntas para todas las panelistas, ¿ya? La verdad es que hay preguntas que están específicamente hechas para alguna de ustedes en particular, pero creo que sería interesante conocer la perspectiva de todas frente a estas preguntas, ¿ya? Así que voy a comenzar con la primera, que fue hecha durante la presentación de Kay y de Sally, pero también creo que Verónica y Rola tienen algo importante que decir sobre esto, ¿ya? Y la pregunta es la siguiente. En varios de los ejemplos, que en la versión más contextualizada y auténtica entran en juego competencias o conocimientos distintos a los aprendizajes que se busca evaluar, ¿ya? En el sentido, me imagino, de que, no sé, por ejemplo, si hay una meta, un resultado de aprendizaje que es analizar resultados de una investigación, a lo mejor uno le hace al alumno hacer un póster, que no es como el núcleo del aprendizaje, sino que es el medio en este caso para mostrar el análisis, ¿ya? Entonces, la persona que hace la pregunta dice que por un lado lo hace más interesante y auténtico, pero a la vez no hay un riesgo de introducir variables irrelevantes o secundarias para lo que se evalúa. ¿Cómo manejarlo para la calificación? ¿El docente debería hacerse cargo y también retroalimentar esos aspectos? Vamos a partir con Kay y Sally.
Perhaps, Kay, if I start, and then you might want to pick on up a bit further. Interesting to me that these are seen as maybe irrelevancies, and this links very much with what Rola's been saying. If we start to have a look at the learning outcomes, if you've written learning outcomes that are all about content knowledge of the kinds that traditionally were assessed in unseen time constrained exams, you might regard the ability to put together a very good presentation or do something that's using a social media campaign or creating a video. You might regard that as irrelevant. But so many employers are nowadays asking for skills and competencies and capabilities, and the kinds of ones that are very, very common are the ability to communicate effectively in writing, in presentations, and in visual media. Now, you could see that if that was the learning outcome, asking them to do a presentation or a poster might well be absolutely central to the presentation. So I would always say, if we're looking at what kind of assessed activities we're asking students to do, as in our task generator, start with the learning outcomes. And even if it isn't in the learning outcomes, if we're wanting to think about their whole person nature, as Kay and I are often talking about, then the ability to communicate with different audience is absolutely central to whatever discipline they're going into. Kay, I started there. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think it was really hitting me, and Rolla was talking a lot about future selves, and anticipating who they're going to be, and it's not what they know that's going to make them who they're going to be. It's that, so the sort of learning we're seeking to achieve in higher education, you know, there's a clue in the higher. There's something about this being much more complicated than atomized gobbets of information or knowledge. There's something about being able to do something with it, and that is necessarily going to be messier. And one of the questions we often get is, isn't this too complex and messy to be able to, you know, parcel up, farm out to lots of markers and everybody come up with the same judgment? And I think the answer is yes, it probably is, but if we're doing that, that's not it. If we're able to just park our the outputs with somebody else to say they're right or wrong, then we're doing something that is so inauthentic. Usually, I mean, I'm sure there are some elements of the curriculum where that is absolutely the right thing to do, but most of the time, for the sorts of future selves that we are, and I don't think we're trying to develop them, we're trying to enable students to develop themselves. And I think that's where some of the debates around authenticity in the so-called real world become problematic, because it assumes that higher education isn't real and that the students are in deficit and not real yet, and all of that kind of thing. And I think that's why I skirt around rather carefully some of the language, because it assumes that, you know, what we are doing and that we're not somehow real. And that's problematic too. So there's something around, not, for me, trying to broaden it a little bit so it's not just work related. I'm not decrying employability, and I'm not, you know, but it's broader than that, because learning is broader than that. And learning to practice, like Rolla was saying, was about, it's very much about tuning in to a particular context. I mean, hand washing was your incident, but to get the nuances of when you do and when you don't is much more tacit and implicit than anything you could say. I can tell you the 5 things you should do when you're hand washing. They are this, 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 and this. That's not it. It's a complex, nuanced social practice that we usually getting students to do.
And to add just a very brief corollary to that, I do consultancy work, and I was working with the university once where they had terrible student dissatisfaction. And when we looked at it in detail, what was going wrong more than anything else was that the lecturers were trying to do the assessment as easily and as quickly as possible with minimal feedback at the direction of the vice principal in order to save time for their research. And surprise, surprise, it left the students disengaged and performing badly, and their achievements were poor. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Kay y Sally. Continuamos con Verónica en la misma pregunta que ella levantó la mano.
Gracias. Sí, yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que plantea Sally y Kay, y se me ocurren como otras dos como perspectivas, que es que yo creo que puede ser factible, un poco lo que dice la pregunta, que a veces a uno le pasa, que uno se imagina que los estudiantes van a llegar a un producto. A nosotros a veces nos ha pasado, en algunas ocasiones con Daniela lo hemos discutido, en algunas actividades que son como de muy poco tiempo en la universidad, que son desafíos que uno le plantea al alumno en 3 días. Y uno espera, a veces tiene la expectativa de un producto que va a ser mucho más complejo y profundo de lo que realmente los estudiantes llegan. Pero creo que el problema no es necesariamente el producto. Entonces creo que hay como 2 cosas. Uno es que a veces quizás el producto no es el más adecuado para la habilidad que nosotros hemos escogido, entonces se nos ocurre siempre lo mismo, como un tríptico o una presentación o un póster, y quizás hay otros productos que están más alineados con esa habilidad. Y por otro lado, que para desarrollar, para transferir esta habilidad en algo concreto, tenemos que entregar feedback, tenemos que estar constantemente monitoreando el proceso para que los estudiantes efectivamente logren algo que sea de calidad, que sea profundo, que sea un valor agregado a lo que nosotros le estamos entregando en la sala de clase. Entonces creo que tenemos que decidir bien para la carrera, para la disciplina, para la habilidad que queremos que ellos desarrollen, cuál es el mejor producto y más realista en relación a lo que ellos tienen que desarrollar. Y sí estoy de acuerdo que a veces pasan, como pueden haber dos polos opuestos. Una, que estemos acostumbrados a gastar muy poco tiempo en evaluar porque no tenemos tiempo, porque hacemos otras cosas, porque otras cosas dentro de la academia retornan más prestigio, más, o forman más parte de nuestra tarea. Entonces hacemos estas pruebas más de alternativas, que los alumnos a veces se acostumbran y aprenden una forma de resolverlas sin que eso aprendizaje perdure en el tiempo y probablemente se olvide muy rápido. Y por otro lado, nos vamos al otro extremo de pedir grandes ensayos o marcos teóricos que a veces tienen 30 páginas y que el profesor es imposible que los pueda trabajar en profundidad y pasa que son muy de cortar y pegar de cosas. Entonces hay que llegar a un punto intermedio de un producto que sea para nosotros factible de revisar en profundidad. Y yo cada vez más pienso en 3 páginas, 5 páginas, algo que realmente el alumno tenga que construir y no cortar y pegar, donde nos demos cuenta absolutamente si hay plagio, y donde tengan que hacer algo que no es solamente recabar información y juntarla, sino que tengan que interpretarla, que tengan que dar una solución, que tengan que hacer algo profesional. Entonces ahí vamos a ir como encontrando el mejor producto. Entonces creo que esa pregunta es interesante porque es algo que pasa en nuestra docencia. Y tenemos que reflexionar sobre eso, cuál es el mejor producto para esa profesión, cuál es la habilidad relacionada con ese mejor producto, y demos algo que nosotros podemos monitorear y que podemos revisar, porque si no se transforma en una tarea muy estándar que los alumnos ya tienen un prototipo de cómo tienen que contestar.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Roula, ¿quisieras complementar algo más?
Sure. I mean, I would say irrelevant to whom first, and so that's the mapping that you do against the learning outcomes, which has already been alluded to. The issue of compromise in assessment design is a really important one to think about, and if you know, we all get hung up about that little assessment that we might have, or the assessment suite of assessments we have in our little subject. But if we think about programmatic assessment over a course of study, then what we're thinking about is scaffolding students across their journey with us so that the assessment becomes more and more complex, more and more authentic, more and more oriented towards preparing them for, and I agree with you, I use the real world a lot, but it grates on me as well, because obviously we're not living in the matrix, although maybe we are, but so in that sense then the compromises that need to be made is perhaps, you know, is there somewhere within the curriculum that we can take something out and use that time to build in, for example, some more formative or some more opportunities for feedback loops, a more complex piece of assessment because they're getting, you know, further along the spectrum. So I think, you know, if we really focus on issues of reliability and assessment, that is, as has already been mentioned, at the expense of validity, and especially consequential validity, which is about the consequences for the individual and for society and the social, then we're doing our students a disservice. And what we see is that instrumentalism, that cynicism, that rupture of authenticity. So I would really encourage you, perhaps you don't need to go the plunge of 30 pages, but even baby steps of moving towards authenticity can help to start to build that into the curriculum. And once you do it once, maybe, you know, you'd refine it and it becomes a more comfortable concept. The issue is for students who are very used to multiple choice is bringing them on that journey with you. Yeah. Building their assessment literacy, because they are like, oh, this is harder. Why are you making us do this? So that is also then important. And building assessment literacy is actually is about self-regulation. It's about helping them learn to be a learner, and that can be really valuable in and of itself.
Muchas gracias, Rola. La siguiente pregunta la realiza Tina Hobbins. Es una pregunta que a mí me parece muy pertinente, porque por lo menos cuando con Verónica hemos intervenido para que los profesores transformen su forma de evaluar, es una de las barreras más comunes que se reportan, ¿ya? Entonces, en ese sentido, la pregunta es la siguiente. Los profesores constantemente comentan que las evaluaciones auténticas son muy trabajosas o muy intensas en cuanto a los recursos que se necesitan para implementarse en cursos grandes, por ejemplo, más grandes que 240 estudiantes. ¿Cómo podrían responder a esto? Bueno, acá por lo menos en Chile nosotros no tenemos cursos tan numerosos. Cuando hablamos de un curso numeroso estamos hablando de 100, 150 estudiantes a lo más, ¿ya? Pero de todas maneras, lo grande del curso obviamente va a depender de la cultura, pero está esta sensación de que la evaluación auténtica es más difícil cuando tenemos muchos estudiantes. Entonces, ¿cuál sería su respuesta a eso? Ahora le voy a pedir a Rola que comience respondiendo.
Sure. I've just popped in the chat an article by the awesome Jacqueline Broadbent, who you had present in panel 3. It's called Summative Assessment with a Formative Flavour, and why I love this paper is that Jacqueline, in her first year undergrad psychology class, would have 2,000 students, and yet she still managed to build in a more authentic type of assessment with quite strong moderation and still a very robust assessment. So I'd encourage you to read that paper. And as I said, it's about compromising. So if you, for example, take out some content that perhaps doesn't serve you well, if, for example, rather than sticking feedback at the end of a subject, you put it early, you front load after a small formative task, it's kind of like a puzzle, and you kind of have to work out the ways in which you can get your students through in a it's not efficient, but it's in optimizing the time that you have, and whether that's through exemplars, where you put up exemplars, for example, and you encourage students to review them, to offer each other feedback, so you can then use peer feedback, which also reduces some of the load. And remember from Sadler's talk, he talked about how the benefit isn't to the student who's getting the feedback, it's to the student who's generating the feedback, who's making those internal comparisons, if we take from David Nichols' work. So, you know, if you get really curious about design and not in a I'm going to tell you or I'm going to make you, but in a how can I make students make professional judgments, then the exercise becomes more fun, and the assessment is learning. And so, you know, they learn content through the doing of various tasks where they might, for example, generate rubrics of quality criteria. And it doesn't have to be, 240 students, yeah, that's a lot, but I don't know if you're doing it face-to-face or online, but if it's in a lecture theatre, you can do the flipped class model and embed assessment in that. If you're doing it, you could do it through discussion board online, if you're using online. It is about being creative, and I think that's what brings in the fun for you and the students.
Gracias, Raúl. Ahora le voy a dar la palabra a Verónica.
Bien, yo estoy absolutamente de acuerdo con Rola. creo que evidentemente no vamos a aplicar la misma evaluación auténtica para 30 alumnos que con 240, y menos con los que tiene Jacqueline, que son 2000. Evidentemente es algo que no podemos ocupar la misma lógica, pero sí creo que se puede ocupar mucha evaluación formativa auténtica, es decir, podemos hacer trabajos grupales, como decía Rola. Yo me imaginaba como ponerlos a enjuiciar en la calidad de los productos de años anteriores o incluso de los que ellos van logrando, trabajar con exemplars, darse feedback unos a otros, entregar como pautas o listas de chequeo que ellos pudieran revisar si lo que están haciendo está bien. Y lo que queremos en realidad es que los alumnos sean el centro del proceso de aprendizaje. Entonces lo que queremos es que ellos hagan con su aprendizaje, lo apliquen, sientan que están masticando ese saber. Porque lo más fácil es hacer clases para 2000 personas de la forma tradicional con una cátedra, y lo más fácil es después hacer preguntas de alternativa. Entonces yo creo que hay que ir mezclando cosas, más cuando uno tiene tamaños gigantes. Mezclar cátedras que son más bien donde el profesor hace un rol de monitoreo, de discusión con algunos grupos, con clases que son catedráticas, o con clases donde los alumnos la hacen como flip classroom, donde ellos están haciendo las clases más, son como más responsables de presentar algunos temas. Y lo mismo en las evaluaciones, puedes hacer alternativas con contexto, que no sean, la respuesta sea cortar y pegar, sino que más bien sea discernir respecto a cuál es la opción más adecuada para ese contexto o problema que estás poniendo. Y también puedes hacer un par de preguntas de desarrollo de vez en cuando, o una pregunta de desarrollo que se conteste en grupo. Entonces, creo que hay que ser creativo respecto a las posibilidades que cada docente tiene para no vivir para evaluar. Todos tenemos ganas de tener vida y fines de semana, pero tratar de ser creativos en torno a lograr una mayor participación de los estudiantes en el proceso educativo.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Sally y Kay.
Again, Kay, shall I start?
Go
Okay.
ahead, I'll chip in.
Okay, so then, first of all, I was thinking about Veronica's 30-page essays. And again, Kay and I were talking only today about some people we're working where they've got cohorts of 400 students. And there's a couple of questions you need to ask yourself. First of all, how many people are going to be assessing those 400 students? One person, then it's no good at all. If you're going to use a team of assessors, how are you going to get intra-assessor reliability? And I think the approach Kay and I are advocating, which is a number of smaller tasks, helps you get to grips with inter-assessor reliability. Because if you've got a number of shorter tasks, then you can say this person marks this one, this person marks that one. But speaking as somebody who used to be a senior manager as a pro vice chancellor in a university, there's a big point here about deployment. And that is to say, if you're going to go for teaching students in big cohorts, you've got to deploy enough people to actually do that marking. You can't just say, oh, well, we used to have 200 students. Now we've got 400. We've got to try and get those team of 15 people who used to teach 200, they've still got to teach 400 because they just stick them in a big lecture theatre. No, no, no. We've got to think about sorting out the deployment. And the other thing I would say is, let's think about what this is actually like to assess. Would you like to assess 400 of Veronica's massive essays, and will you survive it, or will you be very, very fed up at the end? Or would you rather do some much more interesting things where you're feeling engaged? Now, I can't see Kay. I think she might have fallen out the call for a moment, so I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sally. La verdad es que me imagino que va a volver, porque se acuerdan que nos contó que hay una tormenta donde ella vive, entonces puede que esté teniendo problemas con internet, pero seguramente va a regresar.
Yeah.
Esperemos que lo solucione.
I have a message from her that says if she has got a power cut, no electricity, she won't be back. Sorry.
So, por favor, dile que muchas gracias, que le agradecemos mucho su presencia y que entendemos. Pero de todas maneras todo funcionó muy bien porque este corte de luz vino posteriormente, ¿no es cierto?, a su presentación. Bueno, y la siguiente pregunta es para Rola, ¿no es cierto? Si quieren saber si tú tienes alguna hipótesis o algún conocimiento acerca de cuál es la mejor manera de medir la percepción de los estudiantes acerca de la autenticidad, pero en aprendizaje basado en la sala de clases, en vez de aprendizaje integrado en el trabajo.
Thanks for the question. So just to say that I won't know how to answer how to measure assessment. I'm not, I would encourage you instead to perhaps, depending on how deeply you want to go. So for example, if you do the subject, the course evaluations, the end of a subject evaluations, these are pretty routine here in Australia. What you could do is have a question in there that asks students which aspects of the assessment did you see as authentic and why or how. That would be one way of doing it. You could actually have a yes/no question. Was the assessment authentic? And that's just about starting the ball rolling, about understanding whether it was or it wasn't. I mean, you could even have an in-class discussion about the aspects that made it authentic for the students. And actually, because as I said, those misalignments can be really productive learning experiences. So if there has been a rupture in authenticity, for understanding their why and how, and perhaps it might be just a contextual issue that is something around, well, we just need to do it this way, and that helps to allay their nervousness versus, no, there's actually all these other options we could have used. In another study we're doing at the moment, the issue of choice comes in quite interestingly because it's a real issue around inclusive assessment. So students from all sorts of backgrounds are coming into our universities. They have very different experiences. Some of them work, some of them don't, some of them have caring responsibilities, etc., etc. But those who are already out in the workplace, I mean, early on in the unit, we could kind of, when we talk about the assessment and getting their sense of what quality looks like and then revisiting that later on, that to some extent gets you to understand your students better. But so what I'm saying is there's a range from very light on, you ask a question, is it authentic or not, to which aspects were authentic and why or how, right to the end of then perhaps you could do focus groups. So depending on how much effort you want to put in, how much time, and how, if this is a brand new and you've just completely transformed your assessment, then I would suggest a more in-depth evaluation versus an assessment that has been rolling and maybe you're just doing refinements to it. So there would be some ways in which you can try and capture the students' assessment of authenticity.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, y en honor al tiempo voy a hacer una última pregunta, es una pregunta que tengo yo y no puedo desaprovechar esta oportunidad de hacérselas. Durante la pandemia y sobre todo la transformación digital que tuvimos que hacer apurada, se desarrolló como una línea de pensamiento entre las personas que dirigen las instituciones de educación superior y también entre los profesores, ¿no es cierto? Que si los estudiantes se enfrentaban a preguntas, perdón, más que nada, a pruebas en las plataformas, pruebas que eran estandarizadas, y con esto me refiero a como contra el tiempo, pruebas que estaban hechas para que alguna pregunta se contestara en un tiempo específico, y que además muchas veces los estudiantes respondían y no podían volver atrás, como si se daban cuenta que había algún error, etcétera, generando mucha molestia a los estudiantes, pero también es una prueba que en el fondo quita la ansiedad al profesor, porque piensa que en esas condiciones el estudiante va a copiar menos, ¿ya? Quería saber su opinión con respecto a esa línea de pensamiento. ¿Cuáles son los peligros que podría haber si en el fondo nos mudamos a ese tipo de evaluación? Y también, ¿cuáles serían las ventajas de utilizar una evaluación más constructivista, más basada en desempeño, en pandemia y online? Aquí voy a dar la palabra libremente. Quien quiera comenzar, puede hacerlo.
Well, I will, because I think this has been too good an opportunity to waste. I think we've had a chance to show our senior managers that there are other ways to do it. And the argument I would use is to say, oh, we just can't take the risk of the danger to business continuity to just keep going, having on-site exams. We've got to spread our risk. The benefit of that is those of us who have been pressing for authentic assessment for years and years can say, wow, actually, we've got some solutions. And although, you know, you're never going to get completely past students cheating, actually, people like Phil Dawson in Australia are telling Kay and me that our authentic assessments, because they're so different in the way students present material, are much harder to cheat. So, as you know, we say in Britain, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Let's use this to drive forward a passionate and positive agenda to change assessment for good, and make the best of this opportunity to actually drive forward authentic assessment.
Muchas gracias. ¿Quién quiere complementar?
Sí, yo estoy de acuerdo con Sally, y pienso también que algo que nos pasa en educación superior, o quizás en distintas partes, pero a nosotros en nuestra facultad a veces nos pasa que ponemos, a partir del problema de gestión que a veces podamos tener, tomamos decisiones como a costa del aprendizaje de los estudiantes. Como que, bueno, si no podemos hacer un examen de grado porque tenemos de tal forma, porque tenemos tantos estudiantes, bueno, entonces tomamos una decisión de cambiar la forma para que podamos evaluarlos a todos, porque no tenemos la cantidad de profesores por área, etc. Y yo creo que no se puede poner el problema logístico y a partir de eso tomar una decisión de hacer un cambio, sino que lo que nos debe siempre estar focalizando es el aprendizaje de los alumnos, la calidad del aprendizaje que queremos que ellos logren. Y en ese sentido, creo que no es normal, no es parte del proceso de aprender que uno no pueda corregir, que uno tenga que dar su primera respuesta y después no poder mirarla, revisarla, porque a veces uno contesta y a medida que sigue respondiendo el resto de la pregunta, de la prueba, vuelves a la primera pregunta y sientes que puedes hacer algo distinto, o tomas otra decisión. El aprendizaje no es instantáneo, es un proceso. Entonces, poner como barrera para que el alumno no copie, cuando el problema no es que el alumno quiera copiar, sino que el instrumento es fácil de copiar, debido a que el instrumento permite o facilita que solamente diciendo la alternativa A o la B, los estudiantes conversando por WhatsApp puedan decir cuál es. ese creo que es un problema más del instrumento que la posibilidad del alumno para copiar. Creo que, como dije en la presentación, siempre los profesores teníamos miedo a esta tormenta perfecta de tener los materiales, de tener Google, de poder conversar con el amigo, de poder llamar al experto. Bueno, ocupemos eso, en vez de pensar que lo podemos controlar, ocupemos eso para aprender. Y quizás hay otros dispositivos que podemos utilizar para estar seguros que ellos no copian, hacer pruebas donde efectivamente no hay una respuesta correcta, sino que hay distintas dependiendo de, obviamente, la elaboración y la interpretación que se hizo del problema, y combinando algunas formas de evaluar que haga más factible la evaluación.
Muchas gracias. Rola. Kay, Kay prende el micrófono.
I think this, yeah, thank you, thanks. I think this boils down to, again, what is it that we really value? And there's something around talking to other people is part and parcel of most people's practice. There's very few people that work in a complete bubble. And yet, you know, so it's the mapping of what we're testing and then what we're likely to be doing in our future lives is so out of kilter with those kind of time constrained snap answer questions. And really the only reason for using them is because they're simple and they're cheap and they're perceived. So I think there's an awful lot about the sort of myths that we started off talking about, that just because it was always done like that doesn't mean to say that it's the right thing to do. So there's something about us. Now is the time for us to step up to the plate, which is kind of why we are doing this.
Yeah.
Step up now and make the case for this, because the case is palpable, and we've got a lot more people at the grassroots level having just gone through utter panic about what on earth are we going to do about these time constrained exams, and that's when they came in their droves to ask what else they could do. And so if we don't step up now, this is our golden opportunity to try to help people not to flee back to the so-called good old days, because they were never good, they were never perfect. They aren't the antidote to cheating that everybody thinks. So what Phil Dawson is doing from one side, saying, actually, these are not cheat proof anyway. We know that invigilated exams aren't cheat proof. There's a sort of myth that resides in people's minds that such and such is accurate and valid and the gold standard. I mean, you only have to listen to our politicians in the UK to hear that, and it's complete myth around, exams, for instance. And this is our time to say this is actually a professional area of our expertise in universities. But we need the case to be made for that. And we are the people who need to make it. We are making it, and it's just build it and they will come. And they are coming. There's more people. I've had more people in the last year come to talk about these things than I've ever had in the last 30 years. And then saying, actually, it's really fun, or it's much more interesting. But they've got to start seeing themselves as designers, as Rola was saying, and then rethinking some of the, so it's not what can I teach, it's how can I get students to learn. And actually that's where authentic assessment is much, much better, because instead of trying to help them to jump through hoops, you're trying to help them right from the first time you ever meet them on a module to work towards being able to do something that seems a lot more meaningful. So you don't sort of just do learning, teaching, TAC assessment on the end. You start from the get-go. But as Rola says, that means redesigning the whole, I mean, it's called constructive alignment. It's kind of what we say we do all the time. But to put the constructive in it, you've got to put the student in it. And it's the student activity that you need to put in there. And what are students doing week by week, which is why our integrated task generator is actually scaffolding them almost through some of the processes that you want them to do. But it's only disciplinary experts who can decide what those steps are. So I know it's a sort of generic tool, but actually it's how that plays out in a discipline is where the professional judgment comes in. So Yeah, thanks.
Muchas gracias, Kay. En definitiva, vamos a tener que mandar este video a las autoridades de las universidades. Rola, para cerrar, no sé si quieres decir algo.
I need to say, I really support what Kay's saying, and to give you an example, at Deakin we moved to online assessments very rapidly, and we made them mostly open book so that they would follow the to allow students to and so in making them open book, the educators really had to think about how to make the case more complex, such that then the student would engage in pulling resources that actually mattered for the task, and so they were involved in higher order thinking. And the other thing is, we still had exams, but they could be done any time of day that the student wanted over a 48-hour period. So again, those two things really led to a more inclusive sense of assessment, and the standards didn't drop, we don't think. And so they were really good examples of doing things because we had to, but doing them in a sensitive way, as opposed to online proctoring that led to all sorts of issues and is very expensive. And just on the issue of inclusive assessment, the only point is, the other thing we dropped is students could ask for an extension without needing to go into why and really produce lots of deep evidence of what's going on. If they needed an extension or this special consideration, it was granted, and that just made everything, it just simplified the process so much more, and students really appreciated it. So I think there are examples from other universities we could draw on that I think have been positive.
Muchas gracias, Rola, y bueno, a todas las panelistas por este seminario tan interesante que nos deja con muchas cosas para reflexionar. Queremos agradecer a todos y a todas, tanto a las panelistas como a los participantes de este segundo encuentro virtual en educación superior. Damos por terminado este panel 5 y los invitamos a participar en el panel 6, titulado Motivando y desplegando habilidades desde la experiencia y lugar de trabajo, que se realizará el lunes 29 de noviembre a las 9 de la mañana, hora chilena. Gracias, que descansen, que tengan buen fin de semana y nos vemos el lunes. Gracias a ti, Luz, gracias María, Rosario, Sandra.
Thank you very much.